Hirasawa Kazuki, an ordinary Japanese university student with no particularly redeeming qualities, suddenly received an ominous notice. It spoke of his utter destruction, an event awaiting him 8 years in the future, leaving him bewildered and questioning its validity. Within this new reality, he stood as a young boy, his hands trembling as he stared at his reflection, questioning why he had ended up in such a state. The ground beneath him was splattered with a dark liquid, and scattered lilies lay crushed, a voice demanding how he intended to take responsibility for the unfolding tragedy. Nearby, a woman knelt, pleading for forgiveness, while a tall, armored figure stood silently, observing the scene as the young boy remained clutched by another woman. The woman holding the boy continued to offer her sincere apologies, but another, a blonde noblewoman, angrily denounced her, demanding she cease her nonsense and calling her an inferior wretch. As the woman's hand rested on his head, the young boy, still reeling from the events, wondered internally if this entire ordeal could be a game event. His thoughts turned to a console game he knew, titled Brave Hearts, a stereotypical fantasy RPG where the protagonist, Liner, embarks on a quest to stop a scheme to destroy the world. The game, despite its 2D battle screen, boasted plenty of actions like specials, magic, or skills, and an exhilarating battle system that never grew tiresome. Though it featured a linear story, the game's attractive features included beautiful skills, engaging character dialogues, and a wealth of hidden dungeons and extra events. He had played the game so many times, practically memorizing every line and event, yet something felt profoundly wrong. Despite his addiction and intimate knowledge, he couldn't shake the feeling that this current situation was a mistake, an anomaly. The grim faces of servant Clara, wife Jessica, and Hayden, the head of the Stokes family, appeared, their expressions mirroring the unsettling atmosphere. He continued to grapple with the disorienting reality, questioning where he had been just before this moment and why the characters in the game were moving with such autonomy. Was any of this truly real? The unsettling feeling intensified as he stood in a grand room, observing Clara collapsed on the floor. He internally lamented being thrust into such a sudden and depressing event. He recognized the scenario. This was a flashback event, a tragic moment where Clara, the main heroine's mother, was executed by Harold, the oldest son of the Stokes family. He searched for Harold, recalling that in this scene, he should be embraced by his worried mother. He looked down at Clara's lifeless form, then back at Jessica, a flicker of confusion and distress crossing his face as the reality of the game's tragic event settled in. Jessica smiled reassuringly, telling him everything would be all right and that there was no need to worry anymore. Her words, however, only deepened his shock and bewilderment. A sudden, sharp sound echoed through the room, cutting through the tense silence. Hayden, his father, then declared with fierce resolve that he would personally purge that depraved life. Colette stood nearby as Hayden dismissed any pleas as pointless. In a desperate attempt to intervene, he called out to his father, urging him to wait. His body moved on its own, a chilling realization for Hirasawa Kazuki. He watched in horror as his own hand gestured, and his voice, now Liner's, declared, "Allow me to execute her." Hayden and Colette observed as he then proposed a cruel alternative to Clara's execution, suggesting he would use her as a training dummy, having recently learned new magic. He then offered a sinister smile, questioning if this wasn't a better purpose for her than staining the room with her inferior blood. Meanwhile, a young man with reddish-brown hair, Harold Stokes, stood beside an armored guard who held Clara captive. He commanded the guard to throw the woman into the dungeon, finding the idea amusing. He continued his cruel pronouncements, insulting Clara as a filthy half-breed, and criticizing her inability to perform a single job decently, despite the sympathy they had shown her. Jessica, observing the scene with a cold expression, agreed that Clara was indeed an inferior species and suggested she would be useful for Harold's magical experiments. Standing between them, Liner, still under the influence of his body's autonomous actions, seemed to accept the cruel fate being decided for Clara. Internally, he was in turmoil, a dark shadow falling over his eyes as a despairing, silent laugh escaped him. As he walked away, deep in thought, he realized that while he was much younger than the original story's protagonist, there was no doubt about his true identity. He stared intently, the silhouette of Harold Stokes appearing beside him, confirming his horrifying realization. He was Harold Stokes, the heinous and arrogant, the most despised character in Brave Hearts. This was the fate of Harold Stokes. He was doomed to die at the hands of justice, the last boss. He found himself in a state of profound confusion, questioning if the bizarre events were merely a realistic dream or if he had truly become possessed. He was, after all, an ordinary university student, and such an extraordinary occurrence was beyond his comprehension. He groaned, overwhelmed by the situation. Suddenly, a series of sharp knocks echoed from the door. Before he could consciously react, the voice of Harold Stokes, now his own, commanded, "Enter." As the door opened, he realized with a jolt that the voice had spoken on its own, without his conscious intent. He would never have said "enter" so casually. An older man, impeccably dressed, stepped into the room and addressed him respectfully. "Excuse me, Norman." He recognized the man as Norman, the butler, a character known as the conscience of the Stokes in the game. Norman was a sensible man, not of Stokes' blood, who had acted as a moral compass in many high-stakes family events. Norman then inquired if he had business with him, to which he replied, "Yes. The truth is, I would like to consult Harold Sama about something." The butler's gaze lingered on him, a subtle expression of concern crossing his face. Norman, still observing him, then asked if he was feeling unwell. He, still trying to maintain Harold's persona, offered to return later if that were the case. Despite his internal panic, he forced Harold's voice to declare, No, it's not a big deal at all. I'm really alright. I said I'm fine. Yet, Norman's worried expression remained fixed on his face. Norman, however, remained observant, noting that Harold usually expressed his dissatisfaction without hesitation, but now his words seemed filtered. He internally cursed Harold's coarse language, realizing that Harold's persona was actively trying to show concern for Norman, despite his own lack of intent. Finally, Norman revealed the true purpose of his visit, stating, Well then, I will be brief. I implore you to lighten the punishment imposed on Clara. The words struck him with a sudden realization. His mouth had processed those lines verbatim earlier, on its own, without his slightest intention. He remembered Clara, the maid, and the horrifying truth that Harold was in control of her life. He had completely forgotten her plight amidst the intense shock of becoming Harold. He questioned if it was truly okay to simply wait, knowing he must save her to the best of his ability. He pondered the game's grim narrative. Clara, the main heroine, was destined to die by Harold's magic, leaving her daughter Colette to be cast out of Stokes' territory. Liner, the protagonist, would then protect Colette in the village she eventually reached. He realized that if he were to rescue Clara now, he would drastically alter the original story, potentially preventing his crucial encounter with Liner. His internal debate continued. If he possessed the power to alter history, he could become Liner's comrade regardless of the changes. But if he lacked such power, his future would be nothing but darkness. He knew he had to conduct Harold's actions carefully, ensuring he didn't worsen the impression others had of him. He remained deep in thought, his brow furrowed. Avoiding Harold's cruel actions might cause a significant deviation from the original story, leaving him unable to foresee the future. Yet, above all else, he desperately wished to avoid any death flags that might lead to his own demise. With a sudden resolve, his eyes sharpened. He decided that he would avoid changing any general scenarios, instead guiding the conclusion towards an acceptable direction. Norman, the butler, observed him with a subtle expression. He turned to Norman, inquiring if Clara-san was indeed the servant mentioned earlier. He confessed his desire to save her, but admitted his inability to act freely, then challenged Norman, asking if he was truly suggesting he take action to save that woman. Norman reacted with a startled gasp, clearly taken aback by Harold's unexpected words. Norman, recovering from his shock, advised him that if he truly intended to save Clara, he should go and act first, promising to listen to his reasons afterward. Internally, he panicked, realizing this approach would only cause his hate points to skyrocket. Later, in his room, he sat on his bed as Norman entered, expressing his gratitude. Annoyed by the butler's presence and the situation, he curtly told him to hurry and go. He let out a weary sigh, his expression heavy with frustration. He collapsed onto his bed, sprawling out, and lamented that perhaps he had been too hasty in his decision. He found himself contemplating a desperate gamble. If he were to die in this world, perhaps he could return to his own. Yet, the thought was quickly overshadowed by the persistent internal voice and the sheer annoyance of constantly trying to avoid worsening Harold's already terrible reputation. But he quickly dismissed the notion, lying spread-eagled on the bed. Such a plan would be utterly pointless if it meant dying in his real world as well, making the risk far too great to even consider. Suddenly, he sat bolt upright, his eyes scanning the room. His gaze fell upon the various books and scrolls scattered about, a silent testament to Harold's studies. He began to examine the items more closely, noting with relief that some of the books were written in Japanese. Among the clutter, he also identified an empty life potion bottle and a red marble, both instantly recognizable as objects from the game. As he sat amidst the towering stacks of books, engrossed in his reading, a crucial realization dawned on him. He needed to confirm if this world was truly the same as Brave Hearts, or merely a similar one. His primary goal remained to escape this predicament, which meant meticulously avoiding Harold's predetermined shitty actions, while adhering to the game's script as much as possible. With a renewed sense of purpose, he rose to his feet. To successfully break his impending death flags, he declared, his first step must be to consult his knowledge of the original story. He would begin by searching the room for any information he could acquire. They soon arrived at a solitary tower, which the knight identified as the dungeon. The knight informed the boy that only one person was currently imprisoned within, to which the boy responded with a satisfied, perfect. Inside the dungeon, the boy instructed another knight to remain on watch, ensuring no one else entered. The knight acknowledged the command as the boy approached a cell where a figure lay sleeping on a cot. As he stepped further into the dimly lit corridor, he reiterated his command to the knight, emphasizing that he must speak with the prisoner alone. He continued down the narrow passage, his gaze fixed on the cell at the end. Inside, a woman in a maid's uniform sat quietly, her presence a stark contrast to the harsh surroundings. Approaching the bars, he addressed her directly, asking if she was Clara Meller. The woman looked up, her eyes wide with surprise. Clara, startled by the mention of his name, turned away briefly, murmuring about that time, and wondering if it was already upon them. He, however, cut her off, stating he was there for another matter and demanded she answer his questions truthfully. He then inquired about her family. She responded, revealing she had only one daughter. He pressed further, asking for her daughter's name. Clara replied softly, her name is Colette. He continued his interrogation, asking what had happened to the rest of her kin. Clara explained that she had essentially eloped with her husband, becoming estranged from her family, and that her husband had passed away from an illness 3 years prior. He reflected on the information, realizing that Colette had no other relatives besides her mother. He acknowledged this fact with a simple, knowing observation. The interrogation continued, with him inquiring about Colette's age and any experience she might have with magic or martial arts. Clara, still captive, responded that her daughter was 9 this year and possessed no such abilities. He internally noted that this information aligned perfectly with his knowledge of the original story, and that he had managed to grasp new circumstances previously unknown to him in this particular sequence of events. He concluded that this was an excellent outcome. With his objectives met, he declared the interrogation complete and began to walk away. Clara, however, cried out desperately for him to wait, while he internally affirmed that his plans were now finalized. She continued her plea, explaining that if she were to perish, her daughter Colette would be left utterly alone, too young to survive on her own. She begged him to take care of Colette. Tears streamed down Clara's face as she cried out, her voice filled with anguish, insisting that her child had done nothing wrong and continuing her desperate plea. He turned his head slightly, his expression unyielding, as Clara continued to beg him for help. He looked down at her, remarking on her unsightly appearance and her foolishness for being seized by what he deemed a meaningless fear. Clara, her eyes wide and tearful, looked up at him, questioning the meaning of his harsh words. The heavy, echoing sound of a cell door closing resounded through the dungeon corridor, sealing the fate of the prisoner within. She had been left in despair, and though he had tried to console her, Harold knew his efforts were likely the best he could achieve with his current voice. He sighed, feeling a pang of sympathy, almost moved to tears himself. As he walked away from the cell, a voice called out, "Harold-sama." He turned to see Norman, his aide, approaching with a stack of rolled documents and a clipboard. Harold inquired about their contents. Norman explained that the documents included a detailed map of Stokes' territory and crucial information regarding the settlements located within and around it. Norman then expressed his concern, stating that saving the servant, Clara, seemed like a significant undertaking. Harold listened intently from his seat. The two men sat opposite each other, continuing their discussion about the intricacies of the Stokes territory. Harold, however, dismissed the perceived difficulty, asserting that it held no consequence for him. Norman, looking troubled, clarified that such an action would basically require them to yield some laborers and taxpayers to other nobles. Norman pondered the situation, realizing that the safest course of action for Clara would be to flee to a place entirely beyond the Stokes family's influence. Harold, now pointing to a specific location on the map, identified Bloche village as the home of the Liner family. He then asked Norman to suggest a promising town for their plans. He further questioned the feasibility of freely traveling within the territories of other nobles. Norman responded that there were no particular restrictions unless one was a merchant or noble, but he added that Clara would struggle to live if sent to an unfamiliar land with nothing. Harold then considered the implications for the original story, wondering how events would unfold depending on whether the two individuals, a young man and woman, became intimate, concluding that the likelihood of them meeting should be the highest in this chosen location. He continued to explain the logistical challenges, noting that if they were to include Clara's daughter, Colette, they would need to use one of their wagons and acquire a travel permit, which was an absolute pain to obtain. Norman, listening intently, pondered Harold's words. He had always imagined Harold would be unconcerned with such matters, much like his parents, but this attention to detail suggested otherwise. He wondered if Harold truly knew about Clara's daughter. Norman concluded that Harold probably did know, despite his initial disbelief. He observed Harold, who, even at his young age, was demonstrating genuine thought and consideration for the people under his care. Norman then considered Harold's earlier boasting about using Clara as a test subject for magic. He realized that this, too, might have been a calculated move, intended to temporarily isolate her in a secure location. Harold had incited him with those words, perhaps to test his reaction or to subtly guide him. He further reflected on Harold's lack of disapproval regarding the eviction of citizens, realizing that this, too, was not due to indifference, but rather a desire to save Clara. Norman understood then that Harold had been taking actions to save her from the very beginning. With this realization, Norman resolved to give his all to the task. Meanwhile, elsewhere, the figures of Hayden and his wife stood before a grand estate. They were known to be elitists who firmly believed in the principle of pure bloods, looking down on anyone who was not a pure blood noble and not considering them to be people. Back with Harold and Norman, Harold questioned the suitability of the proposed town, stating that if there wasn't a stable environment for Clara to earn income, it wouldn't work. Norman countered, explaining that the cost of living there was even higher than in Stokes territory, but added that the town was always in need of additional workers during the upcoming harvest festival. Norman, considering the complexities, felt a renewed sense of hope. However, if it was Harold-sama leading the way, he believed it could be achieved. He looked at Harold, convinced that if this young boy continued on his path, he would change the Stokes family for the better. Norman saw him as a likely ray of hope for their future. The next day dawned, casting its light over the vast, forested landscape. He stood, eyes downcast, a single syllable escaping his lips as he began to focus his intent. He walked away from a rising pillar of fire, reflecting on the destructive power of raging flames that could transform into a blazing column, turning evil into ash. With a powerful gesture, he unleashed a torrent of fire, shouting the incantation, Flame Cram. He stared in disbelief at the result, a look of shock on his face as the realization dawned on him. He had successfully cast the spell. He observed the scorched earth, noting that the destruction was far worse than he had anticipated from his memories of the game, realizing the true gravity of his actions and dismissing his initial assessment as utterly wrong. Despite the seriousness of the situation, a thrill ran through him. though he quickly reminded himself that it was not the time for excitement, finding the act of chanting somewhat embarrassing. He considered the necessity of making it appear as a fact that he had burned someone to death, ensuring the flames were strong enough to turn everything to cinders, and that the scorched area was reasonable enough to avoid suspicion. He let out a quiet sigh of relief, satisfied with the extent of the damage, concluding that a corpse burning to nothingness would not be unusual given the flashy display of fire he intended to create at the actual event. Later, under the moonlight, he clenched his fist, his expression grim and resolute, affirming that Clara was no longer a mere image on a screen, and that failure in his mission would not be tolerated as he prepared to carry it out that very night. Under the vast, star-dusted sky, the mission began. 3 figures stood silhouetted against the distant mountains, a tall, dark-haired man, a woman with light hair, and a small child, their forms barely discernible in the dim light. Moments later, the light-haired woman, Colette, looked on with a startled expression as a small girl, her daughter, ran towards her, calling out for her mother. A knight stood nearby, holding the reins of a horse laden with supplies. Colette knelt, her arms outstretched, and embraced the little girl tightly. From a distance, the dark-haired man, Harold, watched their reunion, his hand reaching out as if to intervene or perhaps to simply acknowledge the scene. She held her daughter close, murmuring her name, as the little girl buried her face into her mother's shoulder, finding solace in the embrace. Harold continued to observe them, his expression unreadable, as Colette and her daughter remained huddled together on the ground, the knight and horse still in the background. He then approached the pair, holding up 2 fingers, and declared that he would give them 2 choices. The first, he stated plainly, was to die there. Harold then extended his arm, pointing away from them, and presented the second option, to leave this land and begin a new life outside of Stokes' territory. He clarified the severe terms of the second choice, explaining that if they chose to leave, they would no longer be able to return and would have to sever all relationships they had built up until now. Colette listened to his ultimatum, her face etched with a profound sense of shock and despair as she contemplated the impossible decision before her. Colette, still reeling from the ultimatum, questioned if Harold would truly permit their departure. Harold, standing nearby with Norman, simply looked on. He retorted sharply, stating that killing them would be far easier and less troublesome than allowing them to leave. He then urged her to make her choice quickly. Colette remained silent, her expression a mix of fear and resignation. She apologized, explaining that despite the immense difficulty, she still desired to live alongside her child. Harold scoffed, finding her sentiment dull, while Norman observed the exchange. Harold then turned to Colette, calling her name. He approached her, placing his hands on her shoulders, and declared he would give her something. Her daughter, a small child, watched from a distance. She quickly agreed, and Harold, holding a small pendant, sternly instructed her to always keep it around her neck and never remove it. He emphasized this as his condition for allowing her and her daughter to escape. He further explained that if she ever encountered a man of similar age who desired the pendant, she was to give it to him. In return, she was to make that man promise to protect her. Colette looked at him, confused by the strange request, while Harold maintained a serious, almost annoyed expression. Understanding the gravity of the situation, Colette acknowledged the instruction. Harold then called for his guards, ordering them to take Colette and her daughter to join the wagon and proceed as instructed. He warned them that if this plan failed, their lives would be considered non-existent, and urged the guards to take extra care to avoid being observed by outsiders. As Colette and her daughter prepared to depart with the knights, she expressed her sincerest gratitude to Harold. Norman then suggested they should also leave, noting the chill in the air. Harold stood alone, his gaze distant, contemplating the events that had just transpired. He instructed Norman to head back first, his voice carrying an air of finality as Clara Ameller stood nearby, observing the exchange. He then reflected on the recent events, particularly the gratitude expressed for his supposed rescue act, a sentiment he found himself questioning. His mind drifted back to the incident that had caused the commotion. He had carelessly bumped into Clara while she was watering a flower bed, sending her sprawling and getting her muddy. He considered it a truly foolish mishap, one that brought him no pride. Ultimately, he concluded that it was acceptable if Colette and her daughter could now live in peace. With that thought, his demeanor shifted, and he prepared to move on. Meanwhile, Norman, having been sent away, walked with a heavy heart. He mused that Harold must have been distressed, wondering if he should have remained by his side. Yet, he quickly dismissed the thought, knowing Harold would soon return to his usual self, and that his own interference would likely be unwelcome. He resolved that it was time to fulfill his final duty. Suddenly, Norman gasped in surprise as Harold appeared before him, his expression menacing. Harold remarked on Norman's unsightly face, while Norman internally considered the value of his own life, realizing that Harold would never permit him to simply die. Without warning, Harold extended his hand, unleashing a powerful magical attack, a torrent of flames he called Flame Cram, directly at Norman, declaring it the end. As the attack subsided, Harold sighed, acknowledging that his behavior had once again automatically aligned with the original story. He felt a pang of relief that he had sent Norman back earlier, realizing that if anyone had overheard him talking to himself about Clara, he would sound like the ultimate sadist. To Harold's utter astonishment, Norman remained standing, albeit apologetically. Harold stared, bewildered, wondering why Norman was still there, convinced he had ordered him to head back first. He questioned if Norman had heard his command. He vehemently demanded that Norman forget everything he had witnessed that day, threatening him to carry the secret to his grave without revealing a single detail for his entire life. Harold declared he would accept no answer other than yes. Norman pondered why Harold felt compelled to hide his frailty to such an extreme extent, recalling a younger version of the boy. After a moment, he quietly affirmed, yes. As the younger Harold turned and walked away, Norman watched him, a thoughtful expression on his face. Norman's thoughts drifted to the past, recalling how Harold had always treated his true parents as poor role models, striving to become better than them. Despite lacking real power at the time, he had avoided direct confrontation, choosing instead to deceive them. Norman realized Harold must have always persisted in a lonely battle. He knew the consequences that would arise if he created friction with his parents, and indeed, with anyone else in the estate. Thus, he had chosen to deceive both his parents and the people around him. The younger boy walked alone, burdened by the inability to open up to anyone. How much did it hurt him? How painful was it to carry such a weight? Norman, reflecting on these memories, chastised himself for never having noticed Harold's true feelings, for never trying to get close to him over the past 10 years. He shook his head, dismissing the thought of merely brooding over his past inaction. Norman resolved that, even if it meant dedicating the rest of his life, he would make up for those 10 uneventful years. This resolve would stand until the day arrived when the heart of that innocent boy was no longer tormented by the pretense of evil. A wagon, pulled by 2 horses, traversed a desolate, starlit landscape. Several figures rode alongside, while within the wagon, a small child slept soundly. As the journey continued, Clara, a miller, who had been driving the wagon, remained awake, her gaze distant as the young child slept beside her. Elsewhere, 2 knights discussed their recent orders. One, a young man with reddish-brown hair, remarked that their current task was due to their knowledge of Harold's activities the day prior. The other knight added that Harold had gathered not only horsemen, but soldiers as well, instructing them all to remain silent about his actions. He further explained that Harold had been busy since morning, preparing a spare set of clothes, horses, and a wagon, all while chuckling to himself. Later, the 3 knights received specific instructions. Once they reached Bloche village, they were to leave Clara and Colette there. One soldier would then take the wagon to Lights. It was Harold who issued these commands, adding that the gold coins he received from his father were to be given to Clara as severance pay. He also presented a permit, explaining it was for a sword to be made by a blacksmith in Lights. The knights, confused, questioned his decision. They pointed out that he had received those gold coins specifically to purchase that important blade in Lights, implying that giving them away would prevent him from acquiring it. Harold, exasperated by their lack of understanding, retorted sharply, asking if they were stupid and suggesting he could simply buy a cheap sword instead. Meanwhile, back on the road, Clara, a miller, stirred, looking towards the sleeping child as if to check on her. Soon after, the young knight with reddish-brown hair informed Clara that Bloche village was finally in sight, signaling the end of their long journey. She thanked the knight for his concern, yet expressed a desire to simply bask in the scenery for a while longer. The knight, in turn, questioned why she would not rest until they arrived, noting that they would reach their destination before the sun fully rose. Meanwhile, Harold, observing the ongoing journey, acknowledged the sentiment, stating that he understood that feeling. The wagon continued its path, carrying Clara and Colette, driven by a knight. The story begins with a young boy, Harold, engrossed in his studies by a sunlit window, a quiet moment before the unfolding events. Elsewhere, a voice echoed through a grand, empty hall, expressing disbelief at a past event. What? You scorched her so much there wasn't even a corpse left. This memory, perhaps, belonged to a younger Harold, who stood between his parents as his mother praised his talent for magic, while his father declared him a truly superb and proud son. He, however, seemed less than thrilled by their effusive praise, offering a dismissive haha dash and suggesting they should suspect him even a little, claiming it was something like that wasn't really a big deal. Later, looking out a window, he internally acknowledged the success of his rescue operation. Yet, a lingering thought persisted. Despite his actions, the emotional gap with his true parents remained, a void he felt they had no intention of ever filling. His quiet contemplation was abruptly interrupted as a young man, Zen, burst into the room, cheerfully greeting him. Harold, clearly irritated, curtly ordered him to close the door, dismissing his presence. Unfazed by the cold reception, Zen questioned Harold's presence, reminding him of a past occasion when he had accompanied him on the night of the final full moon, even though he had been on a wagon. Harold, holding a quill, sharply cut him off, commanding silence and warning him not to thoughtlessly speak of that day's events, lest he wished to become monster feed. Zen, taken aback by the intensity of the threat, quietly processed that Harold wasn't actually kicking him out, while Harold simply muttered for him to give me a break. As Harold continued his work, Zen observed him, a thoughtful expression on his face. He mused that despite Harold's harsh demeanor, he seemed genuinely worried about him and appeared to disregard the difference in their social statuses. He observed Harold, who held a small bottle, contemplating its contents. Harold mused that while the amount he held was the most effective, he considered the potential consequences if he were to use it. Harold then questioned him about the plants he was cultivating, specifically asking if he was growing bell tubers, bruna, grudo to eat. Zen, looking uneasy, responded by asking if Harold intended to cut up his intestines and shove them into his stomach along with the flower pot, or simply feed them to him. Nonetheless, Harold remarked that Zen's breeding method seemed rather disorganized. Zen explained that some of the plants had been mixed with the potion water, while others had not. He expressed his surprise, stating he had never heard of restorative medicines being used on crops before. Harold clarified that using the life potion promoted plant growth, thereby allowing for a higher potential yield. Harold, holding a small fruit and a pair of scissors, further explained that the plants without the proper water mixture would wither before bearing any fruit. He was currently searching for the ideal water ratio. He then instructed Zen to eat the fruit. Zen reacted with a startled, raw, but Harold simply repeated his command. Moments later, Zen fumbled and dropped the fruit. He groaned in discomfort, realizing he was the one who had carelessly poked his head into the situation and was now suffering the consequences of his own actions. After tasting the fruit, he exclaimed in astonishment, finding it sweeter and more incredibly delicious than normal, demanding to know what it was. Harold, observing his reaction, noted that the experiment seemed to have turned out excellently. Harold reflected that while the process didn't perfectly align with the game's crafting system, his life potion farming method had progressed significantly. He saw no reason not to capitalize on this development. He recalled the data Norman had provided regarding Stokes' self-governed territory, which had suffered numerous natural disasters, poor crop yields, and heavy taxes in recent years, leading to widespread discontent among the populace. Harold concluded that he must eliminate as many disadvantages as possible, as he could not predict when the people's discontent might erupt. He also pondered the ultimate fate of his own family. Zen, having understood Harold's intentions, confirmed his readiness. Harold then instructed him to serve the enhanced fruit to the cooks and to gather detailed information on its comparison to ordinary food, its marketability, and the results of their taste tests. He leaned in, his expression serious, as he gave a final instruction. Please, if anyone asks about where you got those or whose orders you are following. His subordinate, Zen, responded with a confident, knowing smile, assuring him, I know, Harold-sama. It is all a secret, right? As Zen turned to depart, declaring he would be off, Harold watched him go, a slight exasperation in his thoughts. What a troublesome guy. Zen glanced back one last time, still smiling, leaving Harold to ponder from the doorway. What is he so enthusiastic about? Moments later, Harold was outside, intently practicing with a wooden sword. He focused on his form, then sharply called out, right side. He continued his rigorous training, executing a powerful, sweeping cut with precision, shouting, and cut. Catching his breath, he paused to reflect. Phew, I've gotten fairly used to this, haven't I? Since I'm in Harold's body for now, I wonder if his specs are reasonably high. His thoughts drifted to the original story's protagonist, a young man with reddish-brown hair, whom he considered a scumbag at heart, yet acknowledged as a superior character in battle. Harold then envisioned himself, resolute, realizing he was still a ways off, but believed, depending on my efforts, I may even get as good as the original story. If I keep training, there's plenty of chance for me to strengthen my magic and swordsmanship. His internal vision expanded, showing an older version of himself, Zen, a young man, and a young woman, confronting a shadowy antagonist figure. He understood that combat was essential for survival in this RPG world, especially as Harold, where avoiding conflicts in the main story would be difficult. He accepted that he would naturally confront the protagonist's party. Looking out over the vast landscape, Harold's expression hardened with determination. Let's do it. A desolate, wintry landscape stretches out, marked by bare trees and sparse vegetation. The uneven ground suggests a wild, untamed area. The scene shifts to a dense, dark forest, with tall, skeletal trees silhouetted against a cloudy sky, creating a heavy and foreboding atmosphere. In stark contrast, a serene traditional Japanese garden unfolds, viewed from an open veranda, where cherry blossoms fall gently. The vibrant cherry blossoms are now seen in a close-up, full and lush, framing a traditional Japanese building as more petals drift gracefully through the air. Within the traditional setting, a person kneels formally on a tatami mat, their hands resting on their lap. They speak, acknowledging information about the son of the Stokes family. The young woman, Erica, sits formally, her expression serious and resolute. Her father, kneeling behind her, apologizes, but she insists that protecting their populace is her responsibility as the daughter of the Sumeragi family. A hand reaches for a teacup as a voice reveals that the miasma continues to spread, causing citizens to fall ill. The scene shifts to a desolate landscape, where 30% of the entire mountain has been consumed by this decay. Erica's father explains to her that if the decay persists, they will lose their forestry industry and be unable to sustain the Sumeragi family normally. He expresses regret, stating they have no choice but to sacrifice their daughter to receive economic support, and apologizes to Erica. Erica walks away, her back to her father, who continues to apologize. Another young woman, Yuno, calls out to Erica, but Erica dismisses her, stating she is powerless and worrying about herself will not solve anything. Erica stands alone, looking out with a resolute expression, understanding that this sacrifice is all she can give for the sake of her people. The grand estate of the Stokes family stood imposingly under the sky. Inside, Norman meticulously reviewed a stack of documents, his gaze sharp and focused. He then presented a similar set of papers to Harold, who held them with a thoughtful, almost stern expression. As they gathered in a more relaxed setting, Norman addressed Harold, stating that the papers were a copy of the statement of revenues and expenses Harold himself had drafted. He called him a wretch. Harold remained silent, looking away, prompting Norman to press further, asking if there were any major errors in the statement. Norman then answered his own question, confirming there were none. Harold finally turned, a slight smirk playing on his lips, assuring Norman not to worry. He clarified that he hadn't called him out to cause trouble. He then revealed the true purpose of their meeting, explaining that the Stokes family's finances had been sinking into the red for the last few years. Norman acknowledged that they were compensating with family inheritances and heavy taxes, but admitted it wouldn't last and was only increasing the burden on the citizens. Harold then elaborated, stating that the biggest reason for their financial woes was his parents' extravagance, all to make themselves look good. The visual representation of their lavish spending, from chess sets to fine wines and mountains of coins, underscored his point. Harold then turned his gaze to Norman, challenging him directly by asking if he disagreed with this opinion. Norman, considering the grim financial outlook, conceded that such a troubling trend was indeed present. Harold continued, detailing how immigrants from the Stokes territory had been increasing, and many people had been forced to close their farms due to severe financial hardship. He affirmed his assessment with a simple, yet firm, "Yeah." Harold then declared the situation an emergency, asserting that at this rate, the Stokes family would inevitably collapse, though he quickly softened his tone, suggesting it wasn't entirely dire. Norman urged him not to speak such things aloud, fearing that if overheard, it could be misinterpreted as an intention to rebel. Harold, however, chuckled, finding the idea of the Stokes family crumbling rather beneficial. He elaborated, envisioning bankruptcy, particularly within the agricultural sector, if their returns did not increase. He dismissed the concerns of the populace with a dismissive, Norman, now seated, addressed Harold directly, revealing his role as an inspector for the agricultural sector and stating that he had specifically called upon it. Suddenly, Zen burst into the room with an enthusiastic, "Yep yeep," carrying a bowl, while Norman, taken aback, questioned what he meant. Norman's eyes widened in surprise as Zen presented a basket filled with what appeared to be red groot. Zen instructed Norman not to say a thing, urging him to simply relish Harold's handmade red groot, while Norman, still bewildered, inquired about the nature of the items. Zen, still apologizing, faced Harold's stern gaze. Harold, arms crossed, questioned if he truly wished to reject the offering, warning him against becoming fertilizer if he did. Norman sat nearby, observing the tense exchange. Norman, having received the basket, looked at the red groot within, wondering if it was indeed from Harold. He took one of the red groot and bit into it, his eyes widening in surprise as he exclaimed that it was sweet. Meanwhile, Harold sat with his arms crossed, a look of annoyance on his face, while Zen, sitting beside him, beamed proudly. Harold muttered, asking why Zen was acting so proud. Harold then declared that the red groot was a crop he had raised using a proprietary technique, before abruptly shifting the topic. He turned to Norman, who sat across from him, and demanded his assistance. Norman, taken aback, looked at Harold and questioned why he was being asked. Harold explained that he judged someone like Norman, who was familiar with the Stokes family's finances and lands, would be qualified for the task. He added that the situation might require specialized equipment, which would naturally incur a cost to implement. He continued, asking if Norman would also be able to determine whether certain equipment could be installed and calculate the necessary costs. Norman remained silent, looking at the basket of red groot. Harold then stated that Norman likely couldn't readily agree until he heard the full story. Norman, however, responded that if it was possible to improve their current situation, he would assist to the best of his ability. He listened as Harold, with a confident smirk, suggested that such actions would likely anger his father, potentially leading to imprisonment in the dungeon. Norman, considering the implications, conceded that such a response would be natural. Beside him, Zen offered a small, knowing smile. Harold, however, sharply admonished Zen to use his head, calling him an idiot. Zen retorted that if Harold did not, he would only become another source of worry, increasing Harold's burdens. Harold then turned his attention to Clara, holding up a small, ornate key. He declared it to be the key to the full story, promising to reveal everything as she wished. Clara stood silently by the window, observing. He began to explain a new agricultural technique, which he provisionally named the LP farming method. This innovative approach involved dosing crops with life potions to enhance their growth. Harold elaborated that the primary reason for implementing this system was to mitigate any financial risks should the method fail. He planned to share the technique with several farmers, testing it on small portions of their fields. He continued, explaining that even if the LP farming method proved successful, they would strive to limit economic disparity among farmers as much as possible. The business would operate on a small scale, and if a failure proved fatal, relief would be provided to farmers who could not allocate land for the method. Ideally, the Stokes family's substantial reserve of life potions would be sufficient to manage the combined farms. Harold then gestured towards a crate filled with numerous small bottles, revealing that most of them had already expired and were slated for disposal. This meant no initial investment would be required for the potions themselves. He further emphasized that the greatest advantage of the LP farming method was its extraordinarily rapid growth rate. While the size and taste of the crops could vary depending on the amount of life potion used and the specific crop type, the speed of cultivation was undeniable. For instance, a red groot, which typically required 2 months to mature for harvest, could bear fruit in a mere 5 to 7 days when cultivated using the LP farming method. He continued his explanation, acknowledging the potential for the LP farming method to disrupt the market and harm farmers outside Stokes territory if cheap, high-quality goods were to flood the market. Norman, taken aback, questioned if they could truly achieve a harvest in a mere 5 days, while Clara expressed concern over such rapid growth. He internally worried about his own safety, believing it paramount. If others discovered he was the inventor of the LP farming method, he feared they would undoubtedly resent him. He then explained that his father, a man driven by money, would attempt to monopolize the LP farming method if he ever caught wind of it. Harold revealed his original intention was to first assemble a specialized team, but now he believed they should begin on a small scale, implementing strict limits on the amount they harvested. Norman and Clara remained silent, seemingly processing the implications of his words. Noticing their expressions, Harold sharply questioned if they enjoyed giving him such foolish looks. He then continued, asserting that if they gradually gained economic flexibility, they would be able to test other crops as well. Norman quickly apologized, admitting he was surprised by the detailed plans Harold was sharing, despite having heard some of it beforehand. He found Harold's thorough planning admirable. Clara also offered her apologies, covering her mouth with her hand. Harold, looking surprised, exclaimed that their admiration worried him, as he considered his own thinking amateurish. He clarified that he had only proposed the framework and expected them to fill in the specifics. He sternly warned them that he did not want mere yes-men, and demanded they advise him without omission if they felt something was amiss. They both acknowledged his words, confirming their understanding. Clara, adjusting her glasses, reflected on Harold's character. She noted his groundbreaking cultivation method, his intellect in devising sensible policies, and his insatiable ambition that showed no mercy to himself, all without a hint of conceit. Norman, in turn, considered Harold's qualities. He observed that Harold paid no heed to the money or honor he could gain, driven instead by a strong desire to help the populace, possessing deep compassion. He concluded that Harold truly possessed what it took to be a leader. Norman then addressed Harold, asking him one last time if he would become his arms and legs. Harold stood with his arms crossed, a determined expression on his face. Clara Ameller, placing a hand over her heart, declared her unwavering loyalty, vowing to dedicate every ounce of her strength to Harold. Meanwhile, Harold harbored a far more cynical view of the world. He scoffed at the notion of others wielding strength for anyone but themselves, dismissing the general populace as weaklings. He mused that if they failed to adopt his proposals, they would simply be unable to survive. The grand manor of the Stokes family stood majestically, a testament to their long-standing lineage. Inside, Harold's father informed him that a marriage partner had been arranged, addressing him directly. At the family table, Harold's mother expressed her delight, calling the arrangement magnificent. His father explained that the union with the Sumeragi family's daughter would strengthen the Stokes family's lineage, while Harold, still processing the news, questioned who his partner would be. His father continued, stating that the Sumeragi family wished to seek an audience, and in 2 to 3 days, they would travel to Sumeragi's territory. Harold acknowledged the information, a faint memory stirring within him about a fiancé. Harold mused that the Sumeragi family seemed reluctant about the arrangement. The chronicler noted that the Sumeragi family was a noble house instrumental in the country's founding, maintaining deep ties with the monarchy. An alliance with them would further elevate the Stokes family's pure-blood doctrine and prestige. Meanwhile, Harold's father explained that the Sumeragi family was giving away their beloved daughter to support their finances, aligning her with a family that considered no one human unless they were noble. Harold, overhearing the details, realized with a jolt that the Sumeragi territory must be suffering from miasma damage right now. He internally lamented the timing of the engagement discussion, having just entrusted the preparation of the LP farming method to Norman and Jake, hoping for a moment of relaxation. A subtle, knowing smirk spread across Harold's face as he considered the implications. The quiet study, filled with countless books, offered a brief respite from the day's revelations. He meticulously read through his book, muttering the names of various plants like real weed and anise hyssop, Gatun fong, before pausing to recall what other information he needed. Meanwhile, Norman sat casually on a bed, while Harold, in a different setting, remained engrossed in his studies at a large desk within a formal room. As he continued to read, Harold's thoughts drifted to Tuku Sumeragi, the head of the Sumeragi family. He recognized Tuku as a man of compassion, understanding, and extensive connections, yet he knew he could not act freely in places under the Stokes family's watchful eye, even if his intentions were to avoid future complications. He then considered the protagonist, Liner, envisioning him in armor. Harold mused that if he could get Liner on his side, it would be far easier to support him and others from the shadows. As he pondered these strategic alliances, Harold concluded that acquiring Tuku as an ally was more worthwhile, despite the concern that it might cause events not in the original story to occur. His thoughts were then interrupted by Norman, who asked if Harold was developing another new farming method, noting that the engagement talk presented an opportunity to contact the Sumeragi family. Harold sharply dismissed him, stating it had nothing to do with him, and demanded to know why Norman was there, especially since it was his holiday. Harold, however, reacted sharply, kicking Norman out of the room with a forceful blow, demanding to know what he was doing there if it was his holiday. After this interruption, Harold settled into a routine of sleeping, engaging in physical activity outdoors, and diligently working at his desk. His efforts were meticulous, as he carefully penned his thoughts with a quill, surrounded by crumpled papers that attested to his revisions and hard work. Later, as he rested, Norman's voice broke through, informing him that the estate was now in sight. He peered out from the carriage window, observing the passing landscape, which included a sturdy wall and a tranquil river. He peered from behind the traditional architecture of the Sumeragi estate, a soft glow from a nearby lantern illuminating his face, signaling his arrival. A Sumeragi servant greeted him with a welcoming smile, inviting him inside the estate. He was instructed to remove his shoes and don slippers, a custom he found unsettling, especially when he realized the slippers offered were not his own. The servant, observing his hesitation, quickly returned with his proper slippers, ensuring his comfort within the traditional household. Inside, he observed the Sumeragi family. Among them was Erica Sumeragi, the family's daughter, known as Liner's comrade, her gaze distant and thoughtful. He reflected on Erika's deeply sympathetic nature, her indiscriminate kindness extending even to monsters, and how she had once harbored intense hatred for him. Despite this, he knew her sense of obligation to the Stokes' financial support meant she could never truly abandon him. He considered her the one person he must approach with the utmost caution. He pondered the implications if Erika, with her overwhelming kindness, were to acquire judgment and common sense, and then agree to an engagement with a herald who was no longer walking a path of evil. He asserted internally that if her kindness prevented her from becoming a comrade of the protagonist Liner, he absolutely could not allow it. However, if that was the only potential issue, then it might still be manageable. Erika, the protagonist's precious healer, was indispensable. Without her, the difficulty of their conquests would drastically increase. He considered the grim reality. Even if he managed to avoid every death flag in his own path, if Liner failed to defeat the last boss and the world was destroyed, it would all be for naught. He realized the weight of his conscience, but knew he could not voice such thoughts aloud. He understood that he needed to secure Erika's positive impression of him, at the absolute minimum, to proceed with his plans. He extended his hand, a polite gesture, as he internally noted that this was their first meeting. The head of the Sumeragi family, Tuku Sumeragi, introduced himself with a warm smile. He then introduced his daughter, Erika, and his wife, Koyomi, who stood beside her. Harold, internally surprised that his persona could manage respectful speech, formally introduced himself to the family, expressing his pleasure in meeting them. His father, ever the facilitator, turned to Erika and asked her opinion of Harold, suggesting he was quite handsome. Erika, with a subtle smile, agreed, stating he was very handsome. Harold, however, could only offer a strained laugh, internally observing that despite her polite words, Erika's eyes seemed lifeless, a look he had never encountered in the game's narrative. Tuku then pondered how to best facilitate the interaction, while Koyomi, his wife, suggested they leave Erika and Harold alone so they could open their hearts to one another. Harold's father enthusiastically agreed, finding the idea splendid, and Tuku concurred, seeing it as a good idea. Harold, meanwhile, recognized this as a crucial opportunity. Koyomi then instructed Erika to give Harold a tour, reminding her to return when it was time to eat. Erika, with a quiet yes, accepted the task. With the tour arranged, Erika turned and politely directed Harold to follow her, leading the way. Harold Stokes, facing the impending private tour, expressed his polite appreciation, stating it was an honor to have Erika as his escort. Yet, beneath his composed exterior, a fierce determination ignited. He mentally steeled himself, recognizing this moment as a critical, make-or-break juncture in his overarching plan. A young boy, Harold Stokes, walked alongside Erika Sumeragi, the daughter of the Sumeragi family, as they approached a traditional Japanese estate. As they reached a stone path, Erika paused, her traditional sandals resting on the cracked ground, contemplating her next move. She then turned to face Harold, both standing before a grand, ancient cherry blossom tree, its branches reaching towards the sky. She thought to herself, once again. Erika formally introduced herself, stating her full name and her lineage as Tuku Sumeragi's daughter. Harold, in turn, introduced himself as Harold Stokes, his expression unreadable as he looked at her from a distance. Erika then explained that the tree before them was a cherry blossom, the very flower that symbolized the Sumeragi family. She elaborated on its history, noting that over 500 years ago, the feudal lord who moved to this land had brought the seedlings with him, and it was now considered the official symbol of Sumeragi. Harold questioned her knowledge of cherry blossoms, remarking that it was different from the ones he knew. He then dismissively added that he did not truly care about such things, suggesting it was likely just a lookalike. Erika, taken aback by his indifference, looked at him with a searching gaze and asked if his words meant he was not interested in the Sumeragi family. Harold, with a slight smirk, told her to interpret his words however she liked, internally noting that Erika always seemed to change the topic. He mused that it would be better if she hated him, contemplating using more vulgar language to achieve that. Erika, hearing his dismissive response, concluded that all he wanted was the Sumeragi name, but then had a fleeting thought that perhaps she was misunderstanding something. He continued his provocative remarks, asserting that he could not imagine his own Stokes family name being inferior, nor could he conceive of a prominent noble family like the Sumeragis ever coming to them, pitifully crying for aid. Erika reacted with a frustrated grimace, her anger evident. Harold, observing her, internally acknowledged that he might be pushing too hard, risking his original goal if he continued to insult her. He then extended an envelope, instructing her to take it and give it to her father once they returned home. Erika, questioning its contents, refused to accept it. Harold, however, warned her with a chilling tone that if she wished to see her suffering people perish, she should go right ahead and refuse. She then asked if he was suggesting there was a way to save her people from within their current predicament. He confirmed there was, or at least, there might be, adding that she had nothing to lose. The two stood before the withered cherry blossom tree, the weight of their exchange hanging in the air. Harold held out the envelope, and Erika, her expression still conflicted, slowly reached out to take it. As she finally accepted the envelope, Harold stated there was no need for her to trust him without reason, suggesting she decide once she witnessed the results. Erika, still wary, admitted she could not fully trust him, but her desperation was palpable. Later, Harold returned to his own residence, where Norman greeted him warmly, suggesting he must be tired from his long journey and should rest. Harold, however, immediately demanded an update on the progress of the LP farming method. Norman reported that trials could begin in 10 days, and they had successfully secured usable fields without any issues, having already explained the method to their farmers. Harold listened intently to the positive report. Norman confirmed he would continue to follow Jake's instructions, to which Harold simply acknowledged, indicating his approval. Harold sat in quiet contemplation, reflecting that things seemed to be progressing smoothly behind the scenes. He also noted with satisfaction that there appeared to be no concern about his parents suspecting his clandestine activities. He mused that it would be fine to observe the Sumeragi family's circumstances for now, confident that Erica, who cared deeply for her people, would not disregard a chance to save them from the miasma. He believed she would definitely hand the letter to Tuku, even if the actual contents were somewhat absurd, having been estimated from a dungeon map. His thoughts continued, asserting that the issue would motivate Erica to become the protagonist's ally, and she would need to resolve it herself. He considered that if the letter failed to convince Tuku, then he would have to approach him through other means, making the antibiotics as he had planned. He acknowledged that Erica had taken the letter, but that alone would not solve the actual issue. A few days later, the protagonist, Liner, angrily confronted his companions, demanding to know what they thought they were doing and if they even wanted to continue their training. His male companion, on the verge of tears, questioned if he wouldn't also have a bad time, while Liner challenged them to come at him prepared to die if they didn't want to suffer. He then asked if they would rather face his sword seriously. Liner, frustrated, muttered about the miserable state of his companions. He reflected that it was a mistake to ask a soldier to be an instructor, as nobody was challenging him with full strength, even though he wanted to adopt real combat techniques. He wondered how they could call themselves soldiers if they collapsed in fear against a mere newbie. Harold, meanwhile, pondered if he should ask his father for a serious teacher, but quickly dismissed the idea, unable to imagine his doting father providing such a person. Just then, a servant approached him. The servant informed Harold that he had a guest, which surprised Harold, who wondered who would be visiting him. The servant then revealed that it was Erica Sumeragi. Harold looked on, visibly shocked by Erica Sumeragi's unexpected presence. Harold Stokes, his face contorted in anger, questioned Erica Sumeragi's unexpected presence, demanding to know why she had appeared just before the LP method farming trials were to begin. He internally pondered why the Sumeragi family had sent her instead of a mere messenger, wondering if she had come to respond to his letter. Erica, meanwhile, sat calmly, sipping tea with a serene smile, completely unreadable to Harold. A servant offered her more tea, which she graciously accepted. Moments later, Harold confronted her directly, asking why she was there. He then chastised her, stating that her first response should not be an apology for keeping him waiting, but rather an explanation for her presence. Erica, looking downcast, acknowledged her fault in visiting him so suddenly, but he cut her off, asserting that unlike her, he had no free time and she should be thankful he even showed his face. He sighed in exasperation, then, crossing his arms, resigned himself to the situation. He commanded her to quickly state her purpose. Erica, bowing deeply, began by extending her gratitude on behalf of the Sumeragi family, explaining that they had managed to save many of their citizens and were truly thankful. Harold realized this meant Tuku had acted quickly to produce the antibiotics, and they had been effective, saving many lives. She confirmed his understanding, stating that the Sumeragis were currently out of options. He smirked, remarking that the Sumeragi family was being driven into a corner, especially for people who dealt in bootleg goods. He then clarified that what he had suggested was merely a makeshift remedy, not a fundamental solution, and warned her of potential side effects. He emphasized that she should not misunderstand his generosity, as he would expect a lot in return. He continued, stating that while the remedy might work for those with light symptoms, it would be ineffective for those in serious condition, and he had no intention of caring for her people beyond that. Erica, understanding his cold assessment, acknowledged that his medicine would not completely cure them. She reflected on the unexpected turn of events, recalling how the engagement was purely for political reasons, a means for the Stokes family to maintain their honor. Yet, Harold had gone out of his way to provide medicine, a feat the Sumeragi family's thorough investigations had failed to achieve. She wondered when he had managed to develop it, especially if it was after their engagement, and how he had done so in mere days. He, with a stern expression, then questioned if her visit was solely for expressing gratitude. She, startled, confirmed there was more, and presented him with a letter from her father, Tuku Sumeragi. Harold took the missive, and Erica realized she had been sent as a messenger, her father likely believing a letter alone would appear insincero. The letter began, "Dear Harold Cohen, if you're reading this letter, Erica should have spoken to you about the antibiotics that you instructed me about." The letter continued, with Tuku Sumeragi expressing his profound gratitude for Harold's assistance to their people, stating it would be inexcusable to convey such thanks only in writing. His wife, Koyomi, and a servant also appeared to echo his sentiments. He continued reading, noting the report that the remedy had not yet shown any side effects, but patients taking it for extended periods or in large doses would require careful observation. Harold mused internally, surprised by how quickly the medicine had taken effect. His hand held the letter, and he wondered if there was more to the message than what he had already read. The letter then shifted to a postscript, where Tuku acknowledged Harold's awareness of the Sumeragi territory's dire condition and the pressure they faced. He also expressed concern about unforeseen circumstances that might arise from this unprecedented event. It concluded with Tuku stating that, though it pained him, he had a request to make. Harold read the final lines, where Tuku, as a worried father, admitted it was likely out of place for him, as the head of the family, to involve personal feelings, but he implored Harold to take care of Erica at the Stokes estate for the time being. Harold's eye widened in surprise at the unexpected request. Erica, standing nearby, looked on with a worried expression, wondering what had happened and the meaning behind her father's words. She thought that even with their engagement, living under the same roof would only inconvenience Harold. He, too, appeared concerned as he looked at her. She acknowledged that her coach had already returned, leaving her to rely solely on Harold's benevolence. Harold, in turn, mockingly praised her audacity, calling her a bitch and asking what she wanted. He then erupted in anger, accusing her of being cold-hearted and treating her own people as if they were nothing. He vehemently refused the one-sided request, declaring there was nothing honorable about it, and that his expected compensation had been underwhelming. As he fumed, she calmly inquired if he truly intended to ask for nothing more than what had already been discussed, leaving him momentarily stunned. She then stated that she should not ask for anything further and quickly excused herself, departing with surprising speed. He called out to her, bewildered by her abrupt exit. Alone, he gazed out over the distant landscape, a growing sense of unease settling upon him. He confessed to himself that he had a bad feeling about the entire situation. Meanwhile, a Stokes family coach rattled along a cobblestone path. Inside, a servant whispered about having a bad feeling since morning, unaware of the impending news. Inside the moving carriage, Harold, looking irritated, sternly cautioned his servant to keep quiet and not speak such things aloud, fearing that someone might overhear their conversation. A few hours after Erica's departure from the Stokes house, a notice arrived from Tuku. Harold's father informed him that Lady Erica would be staying in their house for the foreseeable future. Harold's father, with a jovial expression, assured him there was nothing to be embarrassed about, as both families had recognized their relationship. Harold, however, curtly stated his complete disinterest in living with the girl. Undeterred by Harold's protest, his father instructed him to go and pick her up, as she was scheduled to arrive at the eastern gate of their territory early the next morning. He knew it. A profound sense of unease had settled over him, a premonition that something was amiss. He pondered how Erica could have arrived merely a day after the notice reached Hayden, given that even a rush journey would typically take a full week. He suspected her swift arrival meant she had planned to stay all along, raising the question of her true objective. Erica, meanwhile, stood with a determined expression, her gaze unwavering. He realized this unexpected development likely did not exist in the original story, and the cause of this incident was undoubtedly the letter he had written. He felt a sense of self-reproach, understanding he was now reaping what he had sown. As he approached the carriage, he saw Erica, but to his surprise, another young woman stood beside her, carrying luggage. He paused, a question forming on his lips. His gaze sharpened as Erica informed him that it was an honor for him to pick her up personally. He scoffed internally, knowing that was not her true sentiment. He then wondered aloud who the other young woman was. The young woman, with a bright smile, introduced herself as Yuno, Erica's attendant. She explained that she would be taking care of Erica's daily necessities during their stay. He clicked his tongue in annoyance. Erica herself was already trouble enough, but now an attendant from the Sumeragi family, a character who didn't even appear in the original story, had come with her. This unforeseen addition further complicated his situation. He warned them both that he had no time to look after them. If their presence became unavoidable, he would simply ignore them and let things pass by, emphasizing his lack of interest in Erica's obscure involvement and the completely unknown character now accompanying her. With that, he turned and walked away, telling them they were free to stay, but not to get in his way. He cast a final, exasperated glance over his shoulder, silently questioning why they didn't simply go home if they truly understood his words. Erica and Yuno, however, merely acknowledged his statement with calm, understanding expressions. To his dismay, Harold watched as his father, with a grand gesture, proudly announced the arrival of Lady Erica Sumeragi, his son's fiancée, and her attendant, Yuno Dono. He urged everyone present to look closely at the esteemed guests. He then turned to Harold, jovially reminding him of their presence, before declaring that Erica and Yuno would be staying for a while and instructing everyone to treat them with utmost hospitality. Harold, however, could only stare in disbelief, internally questioning what kind of public execution this prolonged stay truly represented for him. His mind reeled from the implications of this extended visit. As he processed the news, Erica, with a gentle smile, expressed her gratitude for his care. Harold, still reeling, could only manage a stunned what. He realized that from the very beginning, he had been left with no choice but to become entangled with her, a fact Erica seemed to acknowledge with a knowing smile as she looked at him. Erica Sumeragi stands calmly, holding a letter, her expression thoughtful, as the title My Death Flag Doesn't Stop hints at the unfolding narrative. The scene shifts to the Grand Sumeragi estate, a place of traditional elegance, where a message indicates that a letter has arrived from Harold. Inside the estate, Tuku Sumeragi, the head of the family, sits opposite Kiryu, a trusted servant, asking for his thoughts on the recently received letter. Kiryu, holding the letter, responds with a serious expression, stating that he finds it suspicious and elaborating that if Harold is openly revealing such information, it suggests a hidden agenda. Tuku agrees with Kiryu's assessment, adding that regardless of the letter's factual accuracy, the Stokes family has nothing to gain from sending it. Kiryu then reveals the letter's true implication. It hints at the decline of the Stokes family, showing Harold and his parents in a somber, almost spectral light. Tuku considers this, concluding that Harold must be merely a messenger. Kiryu, however, believes that the letter's sophisticated nature means it could not have been written by Harold himself, suggesting someone else is manipulating events. Tuku ponders this, realizing that the true question is the identity of the letter's author. Kiryu adds that if someone truly wished to help the Sumeragi family, they would not resort to such indirect and questionable methods, then asks if Tsuku believes someone desires to harm the Stokes family. Tsuku considers the possibility that Harold is being freely manipulated, perhaps even hypnotized. From a critical perspective, he suggests this could be an attempt to test the Sumeragi family. Kiryu, however, counters this, arguing that if the Sumeragi family were to patiently observe, given their current predicament, they would eventually achieve their goals without concern. He questions whether the risk of such a test outweighs the potential return. He pondered the implications, concluding that if the true author of the letter wished to avoid the predicted outcome, then the situation was even more complex than it appeared. His expression grave, he then stated that there was a strong possibility that the contents of the letter were, in fact, real. Tsuku, having listened intently, then instructed him to prepare the necessary provisions at once, specifying that they would be utilized by those who still volunteered after the risks had been thoroughly explained. Kiryu acknowledged the order, his demeanor resolute. Far away, a grand mansion stood, its imposing structure a testament to the Stokes family's long-standing presence. Inside, a lavish meal awaited, with a voice encouraging the guests to partake without reservation. The head of the household, Harold's father, welcomed his guests, proclaiming that all the dishes were crafted from the finest ingredients, lovingly cultivated within the Stokes territory, and urged everyone to enjoy to their heart's content. However, Harold himself sat with a subtle frown, while Erica, ever polite, responded to a question from Yuno, who enthusiastically declared the food looked delicious. His mother, noticing his unusual quietness, inquired if something was amiss, but Harold quickly dismissed her concern, insisting it was nothing at all. She reached out, gently touching his forehead to check for a fever, remarking that he seemed fine. Harold, mortified by the public display of affection, internally pleaded for her to stop in front of their guests. Both his father and mother shared a laugh, with his father remarking that Harold had always been a shy one. His mother, still chuckling, apologized playfully, suggesting that being pampered by one's mother in front of one's fiancé was indeed embarrassing. Harold, still under the affectionate scrutiny of his parents, gritted his teeth, internally questioning why he was the only one who seemed to be losing face. He felt his parents should be the ones embarrassed for their public display of affection towards him in front of guests. Erica observed him, a slight frown on her face, while a servant stood nearby. As Harold stewed in his discomfort, Erica continued to watch him, while Yuno also seemed to be observing the scene. Harold's internal monologue intensified, declaring that every single thing was disgraceful, and he desperately wished to leave the place immediately. Later, away from the dinner, Erica stood, her back to Yuno, who was busy opening his suitcase. Yuno recalled hearing that Harold had a reputation as a rather rebellious boy. Erica then revealed that her father had spoken of a possibility that Harold might be connected to a traitor or even manipulated by them. Yuno, considering this, remarked that based on his personality, Harold did not seem like someone who would obediently listen to others. Erica added that despite her own attempts to test Harold, nothing conclusive had emerged. She concluded that if they could not get Harold to clarify his true intentions, they would be unable to eliminate the threat he posed to the Sumeragi family. Yuno listened intently to Erica's concerns, a thoughtful expression on her face. She then affirmed Erica's assessment, stating that this was precisely why she was there. Yuno reassured Erica not to worry, confidently declaring that secret investigations were her forte as a detective. Erica, however, urged her to be careful, her expression still tinged with concern. Unaware of the discussions happening elsewhere, Harold lay asleep in his bed, the day's events fading into the quiet of the night. Meanwhile, Yuno, having prepared for her task, stealthily opened a door, ready to begin her investigation. She stood by the window, gazing out at the starry night, her thoughts consumed by the name, Harold Stokes. His behavior, however, remained a puzzle. If his calm demeanor was merely an act, and if he truly harbored connections to a traitor, then surely some significant event would have transpired yesterday. This line of reasoning brought to mind Sumeragi's earlier directive to Erica, instructing her to provoke Harold during the day, when he would be at work and unable to intervene. Yet, Erica's efforts seemed to have been in vain. This only strengthened the unsettling possibility that Harold might be an unwitting puppet, manipulated by unseen forces. The idea that he might not be acting of his own free will, but rather be hypnotized, was a claim Sumeragi had made. Yet, the very notion begged the question, was such a thing truly possible? This complex web of possibilities meant her investigation was going to require considerable effort. She gripped a small, sharp knife, her expression resolute. Elsewhere, a man with neatly styled light hair explained the harsh realities of their society, stating that nobles treated all non-nobles as mere objects. He warned that if anything unsatisfactory were found, they would be ridiculed. His words echoed the sentiments of many, as a woman with her hair in a bun lamented that most of their profits were taken away by taxes. Beside her, a young girl with pigtails listened, understanding that this forced many citizens to live a frugal life. A young man with spiky light hair, his expression stern, added that any attempt to start a riot would likely result in death. He further revealed that the Stokes territory had been heavily focused on funding its military, leaving little for its people. In a different part of the town, a young woman with reddish-brown hair concluded a story, apologizing that she could not tell more. A small girl, who had been listening intently, assured her it was fine, acknowledging that she was the one who had asked about the town. Moments later, the young woman spoke with the young man, confirming that something had indeed happened to Harold Sama. He then brought up the recent issue concerning Harold's son. He leaned in, whispering a detail that caused her eyes to widen in shock and surprise. She questioned if it could be some kind of mistake, admitting she had not witnessed it in person. He simply shrugged, indicating he did not know for certain. Despite her doubts, the young woman conceded that considering the subject was the son of the Stokes family, the rumors sounded plausible. She had heard the information from people who visited the estate. 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, ran frantically through the narrow street as a door slammed shut behind them with a resounding thud. Moments later, the door was hastily boarded up, sealing it completely. As the children fled, 2 figures, a young man and a young woman, stood silhouetted against the street, the young woman appearing visibly distressed. Other townsfolk watched from the periphery, their expressions unreadable. The young man and woman continued their journey, their footsteps echoing softly on the cobblestone path. They eventually paused, looking towards a distant building. The young man wondered aloud if it was the store Norman had mentioned, while the young woman remained silent beside him. Upon arriving at a shop, a bearded shopkeeper greeted the young man, recognizing him as Harold-sama and expressing his gladness at his arrival. Harold, however, was preoccupied, realizing that the Stokes territory was not detailed on the field map, appearing only in specific conversations or event scenes. Harold then instructed the shopkeeper to give a suitable item to the young woman accompanying him, promising to send a messenger with the payment later. The shopkeeper, though surprised, agreed to his request. The young woman, receiving the item, offered a quiet, "Thank you," though Harold observed that she seemed to harbor a spectacular hatred for him. He mused that she had ignored the rumors about him killing Clara, but was now making sure of something, his expression thoughtful. Meanwhile, elsewhere, a woman named Colette reflected on what she had heard from soldiers, that some servants were spreading word about an incident. She considered the safety of Clara and herself, and the possibility of creating friction with Harold's parents, realizing she had not yet devised any decent countermeasures. Back on the street, Harold, sensing the moment, simply stated, "That's enough already. Let's go home." The young woman responded with a quiet yes. A young woman with long, reddish-brown hair, adorned with a dark bow, stood in quiet contemplation, her gaze directed away. Meanwhile, the grand exterior of a building stood under a clear sky, as a voice inquired about the progress of growth. Inside, Harold Stokes, seated at a table with 2 subordinates, listened intently as one reported that all 6 locations were undergoing favorable growth, and the harvest was largely proceeding as expected. Harold, with his arms crossed, then expressed his desire to quickly expand the operation. However, his female subordinate, woman_C, cautioned that further expansion would lead to a lack of manpower. His male subordinate, man_A, added that without proper inspections, they risked encountering farmers who acted solely in their own self-interest. Harold, his expression stern, questioned if there was truly no one else on the estate who could be utilized, asserting that he personally could do nothing about a lack of manpower. Man_A explained that it was unrealistic to send existing staff to the farm when they had their ordinary duties. He suggested that while Arias and Sexton could serve as inspectors, it would be difficult at this time. Harold then pondered if they should simply hire people from outside. As Harold considered the idea of external hires, Man_A interjected, suggesting that he could inform Harold's father that he needed close aides. Harold, however, shifted the conversation, asking about the soil. Woman_C then presented her report on the experimental fields, confirming that currently, they had not witnessed any effect from the use of life potions. She detailed the designated rotation, 6 times for the bell potatoes and 11 times for the Bruna. Harold listened, his hand to his chin, acknowledging that while chefs had regularly sampled the produce, no differences in taste had been detected. He concluded that while it wasn't necessarily a bad report, there was still insufficient testing to deem the results perfectly fine. He instructed them to continue growing samples and observing their progress. Afterwards, the scene shifted to the exterior of the building, suggesting the meeting had concluded. Yuno, a young woman with reddish-brown hair, sat across from a girl with long dark hair and white streaks. Yuno observed that the girl had returned early. The girl, her expression unreadable, simply looked back at Yuno. The girl confirmed that the stares from the servants the previous night were not her imagination, believing they were born of pity for her as Harold's fiancée. Yuno, however, countered that such hatred was not ordinary, noting that citizens barely supported the Stokes family, a sentiment she had not expected to be so widespread. Yuno continued, explaining that once one matter was brought up, it often led to 10 or 20 more. The girl acknowledged this, confirming that Yuno's investigations were proceeding smoothly. The girl then inquired if there was a particular story that had piqued Yuno's curiosity. Yuno paused, her gaze distant, before admitting there was indeed one such tale. Yuno then revealed the disturbing truth. Recently, it seemed Harold-sama had used magic to burn a servant and her entire family into ashes. A shadowy figure, wreathed in dark flames, appeared in the background as Yuno spoke. The girl gasped, her eyes wide with shock. The girl immediately questioned the veracity of the claim, suggesting it might be mere slander. Yuno, however, calmly identified the murdered woman as Clara and her daughter, Colette-san, who was still only 9 years old. Yuno further explained that she had received practically the same testimony from all the servants, implying that the rumor was not unsubstantiated. The girl's face contorted in horror, a single word escaping her lips. That's. She then reflected on Harold, recalling how he had once offered a ray of hope to save the people of Sumeragi. Yet, the revelation clashed with her understanding, as he also seemed to loathe her and insult the weak. This internal conflict led her to wonder if Harold-sama might have been different from the cruel image now presented, A fleeting thought of him standing with his parents, Lord and Lady Stokes, crossing her mind. But even as she pondered this, a wave of despair washed over her, realizing that he was indeed different, especially from his parents. She bowed her head, her hands clasped in distress. She continued, explaining that while she would persist in her efforts to spy on Harold, it was crucial for Erica to avoid being alone with him, as one could never truly know what dangers might arise. Erica, her expression downcast and troubled, quietly acknowledged Yuno's warning, confirming her understanding. Seeing her distress, Yuno gently placed a comforting hand on Erica's shoulder, reassuring her that everything would be fine and that she would always be there for her. Yuno's gaze hardened slightly, a silent resolve settling upon her features. Erica, looking up with wide, uncertain eyes, echoed the sentiment, as if trying to convince herself that things truly would be fine. Meanwhile, in a different setting, Harold Stokes stood with a confident, almost defiant air, declaring that everything would be fine, his words carrying an undeniable conviction. Later, in a lighter moment, Yuno inquired about a gift Erica had received from Harold, which turned out to be a bag of frosted cookies adorned with a charming squirrel design. Harold Stokes stood firm, gripping his sword as crackling energy, reminiscent of lightning, emanated from his form, hinting at a formidable power within him. Meanwhile, in a different location, 2 weeks had already passed since Harold's last outing. A woman with reddish-brown hair expressed concern, noting that Sumeragi's daughter had not been in good condition since that day. The young girl, Sumeragi's daughter, stood by a window, gazing outward with a somber expression, her long dark hair framing her face as the curtains billowed gently around her. Far from the city's concerns, a vast, open landscape stretched under a cloudy sky, dotted with distant hills and dense forests. It was in this secluded expanse that Harold continued his rigorous training. He paused, catching his breath, and reflected that choosing this forest for his special training, especially after the Clara rescue operation, had been the right decision, as its openness ensured no one would pass by. He grinned, realizing the freedom this isolation afforded him, allowing him to swing his blade without restraint. With a fierce determination, he brought his sword down, the impact generating a powerful shockwave. His movements were swift and precise, each swing of his blade unleashing a torrent of energy that tore through the air. With a focused shout, Harold unleashed a devastating technique, crying out, "Swift lightning." As he did, a blinding burst of electrical energy erupted from his sword, striking the ground with immense force. The ground shattered under the assault of his swift lightning, sending debris and energy blasts outward. Harold stood amidst the chaos, his expression resolute, his sword still held firmly. Despite the raw power he had just displayed, Harold sighed, rubbing his temple. He concluded that the technique was still not good enough to be truly useful. He reflected on his swift lightning technique, acknowledging its power, but feeling it was still far from matching the original Harold's prowess in the game. He believed he should be capable of much more, especially considering the strength of a certain individual within that world, deeming his current level unacceptable. Meanwhile, a woman observed him from behind a thick tree trunk, her eyes widening slightly as a flash of light erupted from his training. She gulped, a shiver running down her spine as she realized she had just witnessed something dreadful. She watched him wield a sword almost as tall as he was with effortless grace, even mixing sword techniques with magic, concluding that he must possess some great secret. Still hidden, she found the situation deeply troubling. She mused that she would never truly know if he posed a risk to them unless she confronted him directly. She continued to ponder the danger, realizing that if she were to confront him and he unleashed such power, she might not survive unscathed. She decided it would be prudent to leave and return later, acknowledging that her concealed weapons would likely be useless against him, making the situation far too uncertain. As she began to retreat, a sudden bwang sound echoed through the forest. Harold, having sensed her presence, threw his sword with precision, embedding it in the tree directly beside her hiding spot. He then demanded to know who was hiding and ordered them to show themselves. Startled and exposed, she froze, her mind racing as she wondered what she should do, contemplating whether to simply run. Harold, observing her, deduced that she had likely already seen through his actions. He considered the high probability that if he possessed such ability at only 10 years of age, she would have already understood his true capabilities. She realized she probably could not lie her way out of this predicament, especially since he had thrown the sword directly at her. Harold, however, was internally panicking, exclaiming in his mind that the sword had merely slipped out of his hands by accident. He remained in the clearing, his gaze sweeping the surrounding trees. He had expected his hidden observer to reveal themselves by now, but despite his calls, no one had appeared. A sudden, sharp sound echoed through the woods, and he recoiled in alarm. He realized with a jolt that his earlier action must have struck the observer, perhaps injuring them so severely they could not move. Panic began to set in as he wondered what he should do. Just then, a young woman emerged from behind a tree, bowing slightly. She offered a sincere apology for peeping on him, explaining it was merely a sudden whim. He stared, a flicker of recognition crossing his face as he uttered her name. Yuno. He observed her carefully, a sense of relief washing over him as she appeared unharmed. Yet, he found it peculiar that someone would find watching a child practice with a sword interesting. Turning to face her fully, he sternly advised her against lurking in the shadows. He warned that if she did not know her place, he might accidentally injure her again, or worse, she could get severely hurt. Yuno, her expression contrite, offered a quiet apology. She considered his words, a subtle smile playing on her lips as she internally acknowledged his statement as a clear warning. She further mused that his implication was clear, There would be no second chance if she were to trespass again. He stood before her, his expression unyielding, confirming her interpretation of his warning. A sword, still vibrating slightly, was embedded firmly in a nearby tree trunk, a testament to his earlier action. Yuno realized he had easily sensed her presence while she was searching for him, and had settled the situation without causing her any harm. He stood in quiet contemplation, the events of the confrontation solidifying his own understanding of his capabilities. He wondered if he truly possessed the ability to protect Erika-sama from someone who could overpower him so easily. He concluded, with a resolute gaze, that he indeed possessed ample power and ingenuity. A woman with long, reddish-brown hair reflected on a situation, musing that this was truly beyond the capabilities of a mere puppet, considering it an utter defeat for herself. She then turned her attention to Harold, noting that Erika-sama still appeared unwell, likely troubled by the foreign environment. He, however, dismissed her concern with a humph, then inquired about the sheltered girl. He smirked, suggesting that if she was so troubled, perhaps she should simply scurry back home. He concluded that she was basically homesick. The woman, taken aback by his coldness, reminded him that Erika was still his fiancée and urged him to show her more kindness. He retorted, stating that if he could do that, he wouldn't be in such trouble. He emphasized that, as he had already said, their relationship was temporary, and he had no intention of being tied down by such a thing, calling the idea idiotic. He immediately regretted his words, realizing he might have said too much. He knew there was no reason for anyone to know of his consideration towards canceling the engagement just yet. The woman, meanwhile, looked at him with a questioning gaze, asking what he meant. He abruptly declared that he had no need to explain anything to her, his voice rising in frustration. Despite his harsh words, he found himself reflecting on Erika. He thought it was quite a long time for her to merely be not feeling well, and he could have sworn her character didn't have a weak constitution. The woman with the reddish-brown hair continued to observe, her expression thoughtful. She wondered if this situation might be some kind of flag, a significant turning point or omen. Meanwhile, Erika, the young woman with dark hair and white streaks, stood by a window, looking out with a pensive expression, seemingly lost in thought. A young girl, Erika, stood with her back turned, her long dark hair with its distinctive white streaks falling over her shoulders, adorned with a delicate flower. Her traditional kimono, with its intricate patterns, was visible as she remained still, seemingly lost in thought, or simply observing her surroundings. Meanwhile, Harold Stokes, realizing with a jolt that he had left his sword in the forest, cursed his carelessness. He knew he needed to retrieve it quickly before darkness fell, especially since Yuno would not do it for him. As he prepared to rush off, his gaze fell upon Erika. He observed her, a flicker of concern crossing his face as he wondered if she had recovered from her illness, and if it was truly safe for her to be moving about. Harold considered the potential consequences, realizing it would be disastrous if she were to collapse in such an exposed location. He concluded that he had no other option but to try and persuade her to return to her room. He approached her, his words sharp as he questioned why she was out when he had heard she was bedridden due to poor health. He called her an idiot for wandering around and expressed a desire for her to simply return home. Internally, however, he was furious at his own inability to convey a simple "Are you okay?" without it escalating into a harsh reprimand. Frustrated by her continued silence, Harold urged her to speak, demanding to know why she remained quiet. Erika, however, simply looked down, offering no response. He considered leaving, believing she might eventually calm down and return to her room on her own. He mused that at their age, it was often difficult to speak openly when someone disliked was present, concluding that her silence meant his efforts were futile. With a dismissive humph, Harold turned away, declaring that he cared little if her condition worsened. Yet, just as he was about to walk away, Harold paused, turning his head slightly to look back at her. He then quietly asked her to wait. Harold, having just stopped Erika, now had something he wished to ask her. She, in turn, also had something to say. Her expression hardened as she revealed a rumor she had heard, that he had used magic to burn a servant to ashes. He met her gaze, his own eyes sharp, and directly questioned if the rumor was true. He paused, a slight smirk playing on his lips, acknowledging her question with a dismissive "Ah, so it's that, huh?" Erika, her face softening, quickly denied the accusation, stating it was not true. She then began to speak further. However, he cut her off, his smile widening into a sinister grin as he declared that he had indeed killed a servant, along with her daughter. He added that it wouldn't make much difference if they weren't remembered in a heroic tale. She recoiled, demanding to know why he would do such a thing. He casually replied that there was no particular reason, only that they had been pissing him off. Erika, visibly distressed, declared she had heard enough and pleaded for him to stop. He continued, however, stating that they were akin to livestock and it was his choice to spare or kill them on a whim. He even claimed he killed the daughter as an act of mercy, so she wouldn't be alone, suggesting they were probably thankful for it, as freedom was meaningless to such an inferior species. Overwhelmed by his callous words, Erika stumbled backward, her arms outstretched as if to push him away, tears welling in her eyes. She stared at him, her face contorted in anguish and disgust, and declared him the worst human she had ever met. He simply looked away, his expression unreadable. She expressed her pleasure at his confession, but then declared she had nothing more to say to him. He, in turn, scoffed, asking what her words truly mattered. Her eyes welled with tears, reflecting the profound hurt and disgust his callousness had inflicted upon her. Yet, he merely turned his gaze away, a sharp "excuse me" escaping his lips, as if her pain was an inconvenience. With that final, dismissive remark, she turned her back on him, walking away from the desolate spot and towards the Grand Stokes mansion in the distance. He remained behind, his fingers rising to touch his own face, a silent, unreadable expression settling upon him as she departed. Inside the mansion, a long, ornate hallway stretched, adorned with paintings and sconces, leading deeper into the estate. Moments later, a young boy named Zen hurried down the corridor, a bright smile on his face, calling out in anticipation. He waved excitedly as Harold entered a room, calling out his name with deference. Zen then approached Harold, asking if he had also been training that day. He explained that he had just finished his own duties and had come to hang out. Harold, however, was in no mood for company. He sharply questioned Zen about what was the matter, then ordered him out of his room, demanding to be left alone for the entire day. Zen, surprised and confused, tried to ask why, but Harold forcefully pushed him out, declaring there would be no buts. He watched, stunned, as the door slammed shut with a resounding crash, leaving a younger version of him kneeling on the floor, utterly alone. He stood in the vast hallway, a small figure dwarfed by the imposing doors, the faint echo of a voice calling out to him. Moments later, he slumped against a closed door, a heavy sigh escaping his lips, his small frame burdened by an unseen weight. His gaze, now older and sharper, reflected a deep, unspoken turmoil, the memories of his past clearly weighing on him. He recalled Erica's tear-streaked face, her anguish a direct consequence of his actions. He acknowledged that despite his intention to push her away, the constant verbal abuse he inflicted had taken its toll, and even he found it difficult to endure the direct assault on his own feelings. Yet, a steely resolve hardened his expression. He commanded himself not to waver, to not be swayed by the emotional impact of his own harshness. He looked out at the grand estate, his internal monologue revealing a grim determination. If he could not even accustom himself to such emotional hardship, he believed he would be unable to continue on his chosen path. As the day began, the thoughts of Erica and Harold diverged, each lost in their own reflections. Erica appeared resolute, while Harold seemed to gaze into the distance, pondering deeper matters. He awoke with a groan, finding himself on the floor beside a grand clock, the morning light streaming through the window indicating a late start to his day. He then sat up in bed, realizing he had overslept significantly, well past noon. A lingering thought crossed his mind, suggesting that a recent slap must have inflicted considerable damage. He continued to ponder, acknowledging that while a fan of the game might revel in such a dramatic scene involving Erica, he certainly did not feel that way in the present moment. He remained in bed, a small, almost chibi-like figure, still processing the events and his late awakening. His thoughts turned to the practicalities of the day, deciding he should head to the dining room, where a sandwich awaited him on a finely decorated plate. Upon arriving in the dining room, Harold was in the midst of eating when a butler, a man with glasses and a neat mustache, entered and respectfully addressed him, asking if he had been summoned. The butler then questioned him about his late awakening, expressing concern that he might be overtired, while Harold, in a small, exasperated form, listened. He quickly dismissed the butler's concern, stating he was fine and had merely struggled to sleep. More importantly, he shifted the conversation to the LP farming method, reminding the butler of their previous discussion about recruiting people from outside. The butler clarified that Harold's presence was precisely for that reason, implying a need to increase their workforce, and then directly asked if Harold had conceived a brilliant idea for this endeavor. He continued his discussion with the butler, inquiring about potential associates. He asked if they could demonstrate the benefits of the LP farming method to various merchants and then sign contracts for its rights. The butler confirmed the viability of approaching merchants. The discussion then shifted to the operational model of the LP farming method. Merchants would be compelled to purchase the method, resell it to farmers, and farmers would pay contract fees to the merchants. The profits would then be split equally, 50-50ths, between the inventor and the merchants. However, Harold expressed a significant concern. To secure talented personnel to serve as inspectors for the farmers, they could not expect much success without relying on a large, established company. The butler concurred, stating there was no company they could readily count on. Harold then mentioned that he was gathering opinions from both the butler and Jake on the matter. He further explained that there was a shortage of independent merchants, and without existing connections, a sudden proposal to a company would likely go unnoticed. Harold listened, his expression thoughtful. Harold considered the possibility of his parents having connections, but he realized they couldn't simply explain the LP farming method to them and expect them to grasp its full potential without proper context. Ultimately, he decided they would focus on their current course of action and share the plan with Jake. The butler affirmed his belief that recruiting merchants was a good idea, but acknowledged that the true challenge lay in establishing contact with trustworthy ones. Suddenly, a knocking echoed through the quiet halls, followed by a voice calling out, "Harold-sama?" The knocking persisted, growing more urgent, as a young man's voice called out again, "Harold-sama? Are you here?" He peered into the room, his expression shifting to one of concern as he realized Harold was not present. He entered the grand hall, hoping to find Harold, but instead saw Erica-sama seated on a lavish couch. He greeted her, noting to himself that Harold was likely training again, despite his own early start to the day. Erica returned his greeting, then explained that Yuno-san had gone out of town for a personal matter. Zen, introducing himself, then asked if she was not with Yuno-san today. Surprised by Yuno's absence, Zen asked Erica why she was there. She, in turn, inquired if he had business with Harold-sama, adding that Harold did not seem to be present at the moment. He reacted with a slight gasp, having assumed Harold would be in his room, which was nearby. Erica observed that Harold-sama had been constantly busy lately, and Zen expressed his hope that Harold would not overdo it. Noticing his troubled expression, she then asked him what was the matter. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady, and asked if he was truly unaware of the situation. He stammered, asking what she was referring to. Erika then revealed the grim rumor. Harold-sama had used magic to murder a servant. His eyes widened slightly as he acknowledged hearing such rumors, but he quickly added that he could not be sure if they were true or not. He continued, explaining that he would be hesitant to presume them as facts when the evidence remained inconclusive. Erika, however, countered his skepticism, stating that Harold-sama himself had confirmed the rumors. She pressed him, suggesting that since the one who was killed was a servant right here, he would surely know it to be true. Zen reacted with a choked sound of disbelief. Erika, still grappling with the shocking revelation, questioned how she could possibly like Harold, or how anyone could follow him after the alleged murder. She admitted her profound struggle to accept him, confessing she simply did not know how. Zen looked on, surprised by her distress. He then addressed her as Erika-sama, asking how she could possibly forgive Harold after he had killed someone. Her internal turmoil was evident as she echoed his question, unable to reconcile the act with any possibility of forgiveness. She reflected on her position as Harold's fiancée, acknowledging her duty to save her people. Yet, she lamented how such personal feelings threatened to simply get in the way of these crucial responsibilities. With tears welling in her eyes, Erika confessed to Zen that her inability to forgive Harold was the only thing on her mind, no matter what. She sincerely apologized for her unsightly emotional display, her distress clear. With a final, quiet apology, she turned and walked away, leaving Zen to ponder her words. He watched her depart, his expression thoughtful and concerned. As Erika walked away, her back to the observer, a question lingered in the air. Is this really all right? The narration noted the striking similarity between this girl and Harold-sama. The narrative juxtaposed Erika, who was trying to swallow her true feelings for the sake of the Sumeragi family, with Harold-sama, who had saved a woman and her child despite bearing the dishonor of being labeled a murderer. Despite their profound similarities, the narration questioned if it was truly acceptable for these two to go their own separate ways while remaining at odds. Zen, observing the situation, realized it could not possibly stay this way. He believed that since both Erika and Harold possessed the same inherent strength and kindness, they should be able to reveal their true selves, support each other, and ultimately, walk together. Zen approached Erika, his expression earnest, and asked if she would come with him. She looked at him, a hint of surprise in her eyes, and responded with a questioning, yes? He thought to himself, offering an internal apology to Harold, a silent acknowledgement of the difficult path ahead. His internal monologue continued, revealing a deep-seated fear that Harold might someday shatter into pieces. He clenched his fist, resolute in his desire to prevent such a tragic outcome. His thoughts lingered on the consequences, realizing that if he were to look away now, the situation would only worsen. He feared losing Harold in some terrible manner and knew he would surely regret it. Unable to melt away the thorns piercing Harold's heart, Zen's resolve hardened. He would never be able to forgive himself for not trying to save Harold. His gaze was firm, reflecting his unwavering determination. He then turned to Erika, explaining that he did not mind being forsaken if he could assist her somehow, even if he considered himself inept. Erika listened intently, her back to him. He urgently asked her to spare a moment, insisting there was something crucial she must hear. He began to tell her that Harold was someone she needed, causing Erika's eyes to widen in surprise. Erika, after a moment of consideration, agreed to his request. She then asked him where they should go. With a wide, cheerful smile, Zen gestured to a spot, inviting her to join him. Erika looked surprised, but a hint of happiness crossed her face as she followed. Zen and Erika stand before a grand, double-doored entrance. Erika, looking back at him, questions their destination, asking where they are. He, however, urges her to simply enter, dismissing her concerns about entering without permission. He then turns to her, a confident smile on his face, and declares that they are clearly in Harold-sama's room. Her eyes widen in shock, a look of utter disbelief spreading across her face. Zen, holding a package, smiled brightly as Harold and the butler stood nearby, reviewing some papers. Suddenly, Zen dashed off, calling out an apology and asking them to wait, leaving Harold bewildered by his abrupt departure. Moments later, Harold opened a door, revealing Zen inside, who cried out in surprise, his hands raised in alarm. He attempted to placate Harold, who glared back with a clear expression of irritation. Meanwhile, within the room, Clara, who had been hiding, realized her timing for escape was completely off. She had been caught trying to peek into Harold's room, and now found herself trapped, wondering what to do. Outside, Zen pondered why Harold would shut away his guest in such a place. Back with Harold, Zen insisted he had something important to convey, to which Harold curtly demanded he make it brief. Zen then began to explain the difficult situation, revealing that rumors about Clara had spread far and wide. He recounted how, while shopping in town earlier, shopkeepers and customers alike had pestered him with questions about her. He continued, expressing his concern that Harold's reputation would plummet if they failed to take measures, admitting he had not revealed anything himself but felt a bad outcome was imminent. Harold, now resting on a couch, sighed, remarking that his reputation had already been in decline for a long time, just as he had anticipated Zen's words. Zen looked on, taken aback by Harold's apparent indifference, as Harold simply questioned the relevance of the rumors. He sternly questioned Zen, asking if he truly wished to publicize the fact that Clara and Colette had safely escaped to Bloesch village and were still alive. Zen, looking utterly shocked, vehemently denied such an intention, declaring he would never state that fact, even if it cost him his life. Clara, kneeling nearby, listened with a worried expression. Harold, now seated, dismissed Zen's concerns, explaining that if his parents were to somehow catch wind of them being alive, it would raise suspicion. He asserted that he had already made the final decision to completely eliminate that possibility, advising Zen not to think of anything pointless. Zen, however, still pressed, asking why they couldn't at least tell Erica. He maintained a serious expression, internally noting that Clara seemed incredibly depressed over the rumors circulating about her. Zen looked surprised by the continued refusal, while Clara's face showed clear distress. Harold, with an intense gaze, firmly declared, absolutely not. He then challenged Zen, asking why he would even question his decision. Zen, looking confused and slightly frustrated, simply reiterated, why not? Clara, her face etched with pain, thought to herself that she could not possibly reveal her true motives to him. Her reasons were to avoid a death flag and to prevent Erica from hating her, as had happened in the original story. Zen, looking troubled, reflected that Harold's kindness was a great help, but that very goodwill could lead to his own downfall right now. Harold, observing Clara, realized she had been crying. He resolved to quickly devise a plausible reason and warn Zen not to tell Erica or face severe consequences. Zen reacted with a surprised Clara continued to weep, thinking that in any case, she shed tears of sympathy for someone else and could only be considered an imbecile. Harold, watching her, pondered whether her tears stemmed from the fact that he had killed someone, or if she was thinking about the mother and daughter he had murdered. He mused that if such a kind person were to walk by his side, they would only be endlessly hurt. He considered this kindness a weakness, a mere sympathy from someone who could do nothing else. He continued, asserting that his actions were not just for her sake, but for both of them, as he could never marry an annoying girl who cried at literally everything. Meanwhile, Zen, observing the conversation, asked if Harold was deliberately keeping her at a distance because he was worried about Erica. Clara listened intently. Zen, processing Harold's words, then cautiously inquired if this meant Harold had no intention of marrying Erica. Harold confirmed his lack of intention, explaining bluntly that the engagement was merely a transaction bought with money, a fact even a simpleton could understand. A few years prior, a devastating miasma had suddenly plagued the Sumeragi territory's forest, causing its pivotal forestry industry to rapidly collapse. The entire continent experienced an unprecedented catastrophe, and with various countries and feudal lords hesitant to lend monetary support, the Sumeragi family faced ruin. Yet, the Stokes family, desiring their bloodline, considered offering assistance. Returning to the present, Harold assured Zen that if the Sumeragi family's potential ruin from a broken engagement was his concern, he had already taken measures to prevent it. He elaborated, stating that when he went to the Sumeragi territory to meet them, he had Erica pass a letter addressed to Tuku. Both Zen and Clara reacted with surprise, questioning the mention of a letter. Harold continued, explaining that in the letter, he had described a method to manufacture an antibody effective against the miasma, along with a prediction of the pollution spread so they could take precautions. He also planned to offer them the LP farming technique. He admitted to keeping the engagement vague in the letter, merely stating a plan to share industrial techniques, as it still lacked sufficient testing. He concluded that with the antibody and the LP farming method, the Sumeragi family should be able to sustain themselves for the time being. During this period, if they resolved the miasma issue and restored their forestry industry, they would survive even without his family's help, meaning the broken engagement would not cause them much suffering. Clara looked at him, a blush spreading across her face. Still processing the intricate details of Harold's foresight, Clara listened as Zen confirmed his understanding of the elaborate plan. He questioned Harold, asking if he had truly orchestrated everything, including the antibody and the letter, to such an extent. Harold simply replied, more or less. He smirked, a subtle acknowledgement that Zen had indeed grasped the core of his intentions. Zen, however, still had lingering questions and asked Harold for further clarification. Harold, with a pointed finger, then shifted the conversation, warning them that they should also consider their own potentially bleak future. He elaborated, reminding them of his previous warnings about the Stokes family's impending decline due to heavy taxation and excessive spending. He declared he would not mediate for them, urging them to prepare for unemployment if they failed to act. Zen, concerned for the citizens, questioned if the LP farming method wouldn't prevent such a collapse. Harold dismissed Zen's concern, stating cryptically that Tuku Sumeragi would not allow anything truly detrimental to occur. A look of dawning realization spread across Clara's face as she processed Harold's words. Zen, still confused by the mention of Tuku, pressed Harold for an explanation. Harold then revealed that Tuku was connected with the royal family and would serve as a liaison, advocating for them when possible. He confessed that he had sent a letter to the Sumeragis, appealing for their citizens to be treated fairly should the Stokes family fall. He added that without such measures, he would be left to mock his own citizens for their inability to survive. His expression hardened as he issued a stern warning. If any of this information were to leak, they would never see the light of day again. With that, he concluded his intricate tale. Clara remained silent, deep in thought, while Zen, looking relieved and fully understanding the gravity of the situation, quickly assured Harold that he had grasped everything and would not utter a single word to anyone. He expressed a desire to stay, but Harold, dismissive, simply told him to hurry and depart if that was all he had to say. Undeterred, he then inquired about Harold's plans, before revealing his own secret interest in swordsmanship, hoping to observe Harold's training. Harold, however, found the sudden inquiry irritating. As Harold processed this, Clara suddenly appeared, also expressing a desire to witness his sword practice. much to his surprise. Harold paused, deep in thought, considering the need for swinging practice to improve the accuracy of his swift lightning technique. He then agreed to demonstrate his swordsmanship as a special privilege, much to Zen's visible excitement. Harold retrieved 2 swords, prompting Zen to question why he needed both, admitting his lack of experience as a sparring partner. With a chilling grin, Harold dismissed Zen's concerns, telling him only to keep moving as much as possible to avoid death, making it clear he intended to use Zen as a live target. Zen recoiled in terror, realizing the brutal truth. Zen desperately pleaded for Harold to go easy on him, but Harold sternly told him not to talk back. Meanwhile, Clara watched the unfolding scene from behind a partially open door. She stood alone, her expression unreadable, as the implications of Harold's brutal training method settled upon her. She stood silently in the doorway, her gaze distant, lost in thought. A quiet contemplation seemed to settle over her as she absorbed her surroundings. A voice, or perhaps an internal thought, questioned the implications of a recent discovery. Clara and Colette actually safely escaped to Bloesch village and are still alive. The speaker then pondered whether this information should be announced to the public. Her traditional wooden sandals clicked softly against the ground as she took a decisive step forward, the sound echoing the shift in her resolve. She emerged into the open air, her expression tinged with a subtle worry as she looked around. Inside, a young woman named Yuno called out, asking if someone was there, while another, Erica, offered a polite greeting upon Clara's return. Her eyes wide with urgency, Clara clutched her chest, declaring that there was something she absolutely had to confirm immediately. Erica watched her, a look of concern on her face. Harold considers the implications of his parents discovering Clara and Colette are alive, believing such knowledge would make him seem suspicious. He asserts his actions are not just for Clara, but for both of them, aiming to ensure the Sumeragi family's survival even without his direct help, should they manage to restore their forestry industry. Clara, meanwhile, is asked if she truly desires him to publicly announce that she and Colette escaped to Bloesch village and are still alive. Clara runs, seemingly in distress, while Harold, holding a sword, watches with a slight smile. He muses that even if their engagement were to be broken off, it would not matter much in that particular scenario. Zen and the butler observe the scene from a distance. Years later, Clara and Erica sit together, discussing past events. Clara states that if what they had discussed was true, then the source of the antibiotics made perfect sense. Erica adds that the timing of the antibiotics development also aligns with this new understanding. Erica reflects that it was impossible to develop such a complex drug in just a few days. She notes that, despite the Sumeragi family's collective efforts to search for clinical samples, they sadly found none. Clara confirms that Harold likely predicted the Sumeragi family's crisis beforehand. She wonders if he had done so many years before their engagement was even decided, suggesting a profound level of foresight. A hand clenches, emphasizing the gravity of the realization. The thought arises that Harold developed a drug to help the Sumeragi family, a family with whom he should have had no involvement at all. Furthermore, he had nothing tangible to gain from offering his assistance. Erica considers that Harold must have spent an overwhelming amount of time on this endeavor, a small image showing him diligently working at a desk, underscoring the immense effort involved. Erica, now standing with a sword on her back, recalls that Harold was a powerful person who easily sensed her spying. She feels something is truly out of place about the situation. She then wonders if it's truly possible for him not to notice someone hiding inside his own room. Clara, deep in thought, questions if Harold could have acted intentionally towards Erica, and for what underlying reason. Erica, still pondering, considers that Harold's actions could be something he planned to once again provoke her, suggesting a deeper, manipulative intent behind his seemingly helpful deeds. She continued to ponder Harold's enigmatic nature, finding his fearsomeness truly unfathomable. The more she considered his actions, the more suspicious he became in her eyes. Meanwhile, Harold himself was zoning out, letting out a long sigh. He mused that it had already been 3 weeks since he received that slap, a memory that still lingered. He tried to convince himself that this situation was not truly a cause for worry, but with his hands tied in the search for a company, he felt it was not the time to be concerned. Elsewhere, Erica and Clara stood together, with Erica wondering aloud when those two would finally go home, noting it had been about a month since they moved in. As Harold stood in his room, a knock sounded at the door. A young voice, identified as Norman, inquired if Harold-sama was present. Harold, after a moment, granted permission to enter. Norman then informed him that the master had summoned him. Harold looked on with a surprised expression. Harold soon found himself before the Stokes family head, who began by stating that Lady Erica had not been in great health lately. He continued, explaining that upon Yuno's request, he was having Erica return to Sumeragi territory. The Stokes family head then revealed the next part of his plan, instructing Harold that he would be escorting Lady Erica. Harold, with a wide, almost gleeful smile, declared his relief, stating he would never have to see her face again. The Stokes family head, observing his reaction, remarked that Harold was once again so shy. However, the Stokes family head quickly shattered Harold's relief with a shocking decree. He was to stay at the Sumeragi residence for a while to deepen his relationship with them. Harold's eyes widened in utter disbelief. Still reeling from the unexpected command, Harold stammered, questioning why he needed to do something like that. The Stokes family head, unyielding, reminded Harold that Lady Erica was the Sumeragi family's beloved daughter. He then firmly instructed Harold, as her fiancé, to show sincerity, seize her heart, and become intimate with his future wife. Harold stood trembling, overwhelmed by the daunting task. He questioned the sincerity of the Stokes family head's intentions, believing the order was merely a superficial attempt to demonstrate that he and Erika were on good terms. He considered the situation dire, as he wished to avoid Erika even under normal circumstances. He internally likened the forced intimacy to stepping into a minefield, while Erika stood nearby, her expression unreadable. However, a new thought struck him. His original plan to propose the LP farming method to Tuku was contingent on selling it to a company in Stokes territory and performing more trials. He wondered if this forced proximity could actually be an unexpected opportunity to spread his method. Meanwhile, Zen, observing the situation, reflected that things currently did not seem promising for Harold's plans. He considered the implications if the Sumeragi family were to become involved. Harold, having decided on his course of action, believed the situation could work out, confident that his best card for making Tuku an ally had already been played. He resolved to trust in Tuku's deep sympathy and take a gamble. The butler, overhearing, began preparing for their imminent departure. Harold, with a slight smirk, dismissed the Stokes family head as naive. The family head, oblivious to Harold's true thoughts, expressed his happiness, remarking on how intimate Harold and Erika had become without him even realizing it. The narrative shifted to a serene, rural landscape, revealing the Bloesh village nestled amidst rolling hills and lush forests. A traveler approached a villager in Bloesh village, politely inquiring if he might ask something. The villager, looking curious, agreed to listen. The traveler, a young man with a friendly smile, revealed he was searching for a woman named Clara Meller. A young Harold stood, his expression serious, as the narrative shifted to a new chapter titled Spies. Far from the bustling cities, a serene rural landscape unfolded, dotted with small, humble dwellings. Within this tranquil setting, Clara diligently performed her chores, humming a soft tune as she hung the freshly washed clothes to dry, shaking out a large sheet with a brisk snap. She smiled, content that the day's laundry was complete, though a small figure could be seen playing in the distance. As she stood, a pleasant breeze swept over her, and her gaze drifted across the vast, open landscape, a thoughtful expression settling on her face. She mused on the passage of time, realizing that 5 months had already elapsed since the pivotal event, yet it still felt surreal, like a dream. Her thoughts drifted back to that fateful day when Harold, then a young boy, was to be executed by the feudal lord and removed from this world. Zen, a young man, watched with a smile, while Clara herself was present, observing the grim proceedings. The boy who offered a helping hand, Harold, was barely a year younger than her own daughter, a fact that still resonated with her. Clara quickly admonished herself for such intrusive thoughts, yet she couldn't help but wonder about Harold's whereabouts and activities since that time, pondering if there was any means to discover his current state. She concluded that her very existence, if revealed, would only cause trouble for Harold. She was no longer permitted to involve herself with the Stokes family, a restriction she understood. Just then, Yuno approached, greeting her with a cheerful morning. Clara. She was greeted by Leona, who wished her good morning. Leona then inquired if she had seen Liner around, to which Clara mused that she already knew the answer. Leona confirmed her suspicion, explaining that Liner had gone to the ranch with Colette to buy milk. Leona apologized for Liner's frequent errands, noting that he always carried back their milk. Despite his appearance, she added, it was fine, as the boy was aiming to join the chivalric order and needed to train his body as much as possible. Clara offered a soft agreement, smiling, as Leona waved goodbye, playfully urging her to continue working Liner hard from now on. Now alone, she considered preparing the cookies she had baked the previous day, anticipating the return of Liner and Colette. As she pondered, a cloaked figure approached her, asking if she was Clara Meller. She confirmed her identity, but a hint of caution entered her voice. The man, with a direct gaze, stated he would cut straight to the chase, then asked if she knew anything about the boy named Harold Stokes. Clara's eyes widened in surprise. He continued, revealing that rumors were circulating in Stokes' territory, claiming the aforementioned boy had murdered a servant. He then pressed Clara for her opinion on the validity of those rumors, leaving her visibly stunned. She clenched her fist, her thoughts turning to other possibilities beyond the grim rumors. Despite her visible distress, the cloaked man calmly stated he would come by again. Clara, still reeling, insisted she knew nothing and firmly asked him to take his leave. She was consumed by a terrifying vision. If the feudal lord truly became suspicious, then Harold would face a dire fate. Her mind conjured the image of the Stokes family head, a sinister figure, poised to strike Harold down with a sword. Her desperate plea echoed in the silence, a fervent prayer to a higher power to intervene. Her silent prayer continued, a desperate plea for Harold's protection, somehow, from the looming threat. Meanwhile, at a grand estate, a young man with light blonde hair, Tuku, greeted the arriving party. He welcomed Erika and Yuno, who stood alongside Norman. He then turned his attention to Harold, offering him a warm welcome as well. After instructing that the group would be escorted to their rooms shortly and encouraging them to rest after their long journey, Tuku called out to Harold, addressing him directly. Harold, however, cut him off, stating he had something important to discuss and demanded Tuku make time in his schedule later. Tuku, maintaining his composure, politely suggested they meet tomorrow evening, explaining he was busy with work at the moment. Harold, though internally annoyed by the delay, agreed to the new time. Despite his outward agreement, Harold internally mused about Tuku's unwavering composure, noting that he remained as composed as he was described in the original story. The group then began to walk away. Far away, Clara stood in quiet contemplation, her gaze distant and thoughtful. Yuno approached Tuku, who acknowledged her presence, asking what she needed. He then turned to face her, awaiting her response. She then presented him with a document, explaining that it contained a report on the current state of affairs in Stokes territory and her findings regarding Harold. He accepted the report, commending her hard work and stating he would read it later. She watched him depart, a pensive expression on her face. She reflected on the time that had passed since that fateful day, realizing that despite her efforts, she had not yet uncovered any significant leads. Her thoughts drifted to her attempts to gather information, recalling how she had been skillfully evaded by the 3 servants who frequently interacted with Harold. She remembered Zen's hurried excuses, the butler's polite but deflecting questions about his attire, and the Stokes family head's dismissive attitude. She mused that Harold must be flawlessly controlling the spread of information, though she admitted to herself that she had managed to extract a little more from Zen than the others. Her investigation also touched upon the agricultural sector, where, according to her private investigators, an inspector often ventured. However, they had been unable to ascertain the true purpose of these visits. She concluded that a deeper investigation would be necessary, especially considering the close-knit nature of the small groups of independent farmers, which would make infiltration difficult. Her contemplation was abruptly broken by a voice calling her name, Yuno-sama, from behind her. She realized it would be difficult to continue her inquiries at that moment. She turned to see Clara under for Seeker, who remarked on her swift return, adding that it was a coincidence. He then asked if she had found the person she was looking for. He confirmed that the woman named Clara Amelier was indeed in Bloche village. Yuno, surprised by the confirmation, inquired if he had been unable to meet her in person. He clarified that he had made contact, but she had refused to comment on the truth of the incident, though she clearly knew Harold. Yuno acknowledged this revelation, her expression thoughtful. A realization then dawned on Yuno. She concluded there was no other option left to them. With her decision made, Yuno declared that she would have to visit the woman herself. The cloaked man watched her, a silent observer to her resolve. Harold sipped his green tea, a thoughtful expression on his face as he noted Tasuku's tardiness. He reflected on the LP farming method, recalling that it was originally conceived to slow the decline of the Stokes family. He considered the implications if the Sumeragi family, who remained neutral in the conflict, were to learn of this method, certain they would seize the opportunity. Harold knew the miasma would be resolved by Reiner in a year, but before that, he needed Tasuku on his side. With Tasuku's cooperation, they could support Reiner and the others from behind the scenes, making it easier to avoid the dreaded death flags. This was why he had sent a letter to Tasuku, believing the risk of taking this path, one that diverged from the game's original events, was worth it. Harold explained to the Stokes family head that the LP farming method could not be exactly replicated as it was within the game. Therefore, it was necessary to create more prototypes to successfully sell it to Tasuku. He continued, emphasizing that even with their current progress, they still needed to significantly improve the quality of the technology. Harold elaborated on the current predicament, stating that without further improvements, they could not widely spread LP farming, no matter how hard they tried. He lamented that until now, the situation had been predictable, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to get work done due to labor shortages. This stagnation would prevent them from attracting Tasuku's crucial cooperation. He realized with a jolt that the only way to avoid the looming death flag was to discuss this matter immediately. Harold, holding a document firmly, declared his resolve to present this important information without fail. He arrived to find Tasuku, who immediately apologized for keeping him waiting, explaining that his work had been extended. Harold noted Tasuku's busy schedule, but acknowledged that the situation had become considerably better thanks to the antibiotic he had created. He then instructed Tasuku to raise his head, stating firmly that he had not acted to be thanked. Tasuku, however, remained truly grateful, offering his thanks once more. He insisted that he could not afford to do otherwise, explaining that regardless of Harold's intentions, it was an unshakable truth that the situation had changed for the better because of him. Harold, however, dismissed Tasuku's gratitude as worthless, criticizing him for having no choice but to lower his head to a child like himself, shamed by his own incompetence. Tasuku was left speechless. He then expressed his happiness at meeting a young man like Harold, whose future, as far as he was concerned, was full of expectations. Harold, with a slight smile, told Tasuku that if that were the case, he should wag his tail and cooperate. Tasuku questioned Harold's abruptness, asking if that was the reason he had been summoned, without any introduction. Harold, ignoring the question, stated he had no intention of engaging in a game of gauging each other's hands, and instead instructed Tasuku to read the documents first. He then examined the documents, which detailed the LP farming method, and presented the prototype results of agricultural products using life potions. Tasuku pondered the meaning of the LP farming method. Tasuku's eyes widened as he absorbed the contents of the document. The comparison graph of the products showed an astonishing result. The crops produced twice the yield of traditional farming methods. He looked up to see Harold watching him, a subtle smirk playing on the young man's lips, as if anticipating his reaction. Harold then affirmed the veracity of the claims, stating that it was indeed the truth. Tasuku, still processing the information, admitted that the contents were almost unbelievable. Harold challenged him further, asking if he would simply state his disbelief. Tasuku, surprised by the directness, wondered if his skepticism was precisely what Harold had expected. Despite his doubts, Tasuku explained that the sheer audacity of the claims made him want to hear more. He reasoned that dismissing such incredible content outright would be foolish, especially coming from the one who had saved the Sumeragi family with his antibiotics. Harold, maintaining his composure, simply stated that listening to his proposal, whether it proved true or false, would cost nothing. Tuku acknowledged this, realizing that even just being privy to such a document was a significant gain for him. He agreed to listen. Harold then offered him a copy of the document, casually remarking that it was merely a duplicate. As Harold took a sip from his cup, Tuku observed him intently. He reflected on Yuno's report, which suggested that Harold was not a puppet of any external force, and that his actions were likely driven by his own will, as such a high degree of manipulation was deemed impossible. Harold continued to drink, seemingly unfazed. Tuku considered his own position. If he were to end the negotiation now, feigning disbelief, he could still proceed with the LP farming method using the manuscript, incurring no losses. He pondered Harold's calculated demeanor and the casual offer of the document. Harold's offer to grant him the initiative in negotiations weighed heavily on Tuku's mind, but he sensed a deeper implication behind the gesture. He wondered if this was merely an opening gambit, a prelude to a more significant issue Harold intended to address. Pulling out of the negotiation now would be too dangerous, he concluded. Perhaps Harold was allowing the Sumeragi to test the LP farming method, or perhaps there was an inherent flaw within the method itself. Whatever the truth, Tuku clenched his fist, resolute in his decision to prevent any possibility of harm to the Sumeragi. With a renewed sense of purpose, he decided to listen intently to Harold's main proposal and discern his true motives as thoroughly as possible. He then informed Harold that he would accept his offer, stating that without this cooperation, the negotiation could not proceed. Harold simply nodded in agreement. Tuku, still pondering Harold's earlier words, asked for clarification. Harold, with his arms crossed, challenged him in return, asking for his opinion assuming the document's contents were entirely true. Tuku explained that after implementing the method and successfully increasing the harvest without any particular issues, a robust production system could be established within their territory, calling it a groundbreaking invention. He further elaborated that once a certain degree of market dominance was secured, he would then allow the method to spread across the entire country. Harold's gaze sharpened as he questioned Tuku, asking if he truly would not monopolize the method. Tuku affirmed his stance, explaining that monopolizing such resources for a select few would inevitably trigger disputes in the future. He believed it would be foolish to become so consumed by immediate profits that they would find themselves surrounded by enemies. He concluded by stating that while profiting from LP farming was acceptable, being perceived as an enemy by the surrounding populace was simply irritating. A subtle smirk played on Harold's lips as he declared that Tuku had passed his test. Having approved Tuku's strategy, he then revealed his true purpose for the meeting, stating that he had come to make a proposal. Tuku, listening intently, indicated that he was eager to hear it. He then declared his intention for Tuku to become the joint developer of LP farming, a significant role in the method's future. Tuku looked on, absorbing the weight of this new responsibility. The young man, Harold, sat calmly, sipping tea from a delicate cup. He looked up, his expression hinting at mild impatience, and remarked that Tuku was late. He reflected on the LP farming method, a technology he had originally conceived using his knowledge from a game. This method was intended to slow the decline of the Stokes family, and he recalled its initial adoption. He considered the Sumeragi family, now facing an economic crisis, and felt certain they would be eager to acquire his innovative method. He then envisioned the future, 8 years hence, when the miasma would be dealt with by the protagonist Liner and his followers. He had sent a letter to Tuku precisely because he believed that allying with him now would allow him to support Liner from the shadows and strategically avoid any detrimental flags that might arise. He explained to Tuku that the LP farming method could not be implemented exactly as it was in the game. Therefore, he needed to conduct more trials before it could be sold. He worried internally that if he were to discuss a technology with inherent irregularities, Tuku might not take him seriously. He realized that without Tuku's crucial support, he would be unable to widely disseminate the LP farming method and would be forced to wait until the original story began 8 years later. Despite everything proceeding according to plan thus far, he currently lacked the necessary personnel, making it difficult to increase production. To circumvent this impending obstacle, he concluded that he had no alternative but to present a direct proposal to Tuku at this very moment. He held the document firmly, his gaze resolute, declaring his unwavering intent to win this massive wager and bring home the prize. He entered the room, offering an apology for the delay and explaining that his work had held him up. Tuku, observing him, noted that he still seemed to be struggling. Harold acknowledged this, but assured him that thanks to the antibiotics Tuku had recommended, his condition was now much improved. Tuku then instructed him to raise his head, deeming his bowed posture unsightly, and clarified that his assistance was not given for the gratitude of losers. Despite the harsh words, Harold, still in a respectful bow, offered his sincere thanks, expressing genuine gratitude. Harold firmly stated that it was an undeniable truth that circumstances had taken a turn for the better because of Tuku's intervention. Tuku scoffed, dismissing Harold's sentiment as idiotic and telling him he should be ashamed for feeling the need to bow down to a mere child. Harold, though internally frustrated, simply replied that he had nothing to say in response. However, Tuku then shifted his tone, expressing his absolute delight at having encountered such a promising young man. With a slight smile, Harold inquired if that was truly the case, then boldly suggested that if Tuku was indeed delighted, he should wag his tail like a dog and agree to work alongside. Tuku, taken aback by the sudden directness, questioned if Harold was immediately jumping to business, and if this was the true reason for his request for an audience. Harold confirmed his lack of intention to flatter, stating that he simply wanted Tuku to read the document he placed on the table before them. Tuku picked up the document, its title clearly visible, LP Farming Method. He began to read, discovering it detailed the trial results for crops that utilized the healing medicine known as life potion. His eyes widened as he saw a harvest comparison graph, revealing that the yields for every crop were several times greater than those achieved through traditional cultivation methods. Tuku's stunned silence was met by Harold's confident, almost mischievous smirk. Behind him, another young man stood with arms crossed, observing the scene. He slowly reached out, his hand resting on the table as he finally spoke, admitting that while the data was true, it was simply staggering. Harold, however, challenged him, asking why he wouldn't just admit it was unbelievable. Tuku, in turn, questioned if Harold had expected him to find it suspicious. He then reflected on the situation, acknowledging that the results were so extraordinary they compelled further inquiry. He found it frightening how he couldn't simply dismiss Harold, especially considering he was the one who provided the manufacturing method for the antibiotic that saved the Sumeragi territory. Harold, sensing his internal conflict, interjected, stating that regardless of the truth, it was free to ask questions. He conceded, explaining that merely presenting the data was already largely profitable for Harold. Harold then produced a manuscript, offering it freely to Tuku, stating it was just a manuscript after all. As Harold took a sip from his cup, Tuku's thoughts raced. He realized Harold was no one's puppet, but rather a person thinking and acting for himself. He seemed to be exactly as Yuho's report had described. He further mused that it was impossible to manipulate someone to such a degree through teachings or brainwashing, a fact evident just by talking to him. He continued his internal monologue, considering that if he were to express his disbelief and end the discussion by referring to the manuscript, the Sumeragi family would profit for free. He recalled Harold's earlier words, "If you want it, you can have it. It's just the manuscript after all." Yet, despite Harold's seemingly generous offer, he understood that Harold had deliberately left it to him to initiate the discussion, placing the ball firmly in his court. He pondered the true nature of Harold's actions, wondering if the offer of the LP farming method manuscript was merely a prelude to a deeper, more significant issue. He considered the possibility that backing away now could be dangerous, or that the method itself might contain hidden flaws. He resolved to impede any potential harm to the Sumeragi clan. With a firm resolve, he decided to listen to Harold's concerns and discern his true intentions as best he could. He then informed Harold that he would hear out his request, adding that if he did not state it, their conversation could not continue. Harold simply acknowledged his statement. Harold, with his arms crossed, challenged him, asking what a loser like him would make of the data, assuming its contents were factual. Tuku explained that if the method proved effective without complications, he would initiate production in his territory, then, after establishing dominance, expand its reach across the entire country. Harold remarked that it was a groundbreaking invention. Harold then looked at him intently, questioning if he would truly refrain from monopolizing it. Tuku affirmed that he would not, explaining that one should not carelessly create enemies by succumbing to the temptation of quick profit, as a handful of people hoarding all the wealth would quickly lead to war. Harold smirked slightly, declaring that he basically shared the same opinion. Then, after calling Tuku a loser once more, pronounced, "Very good. You passed." Harold then revealed that this was precisely why he had come to make a proposal. Tuku, maintaining a serious expression, invited him to speak freely. Tuku listened as Harold, with a confident smirk, declared his intention to make him, Tuku, the joint developer of the LP farming method, despite his earlier assessment. Harold stood outside a traditional shop, his expression thoughtful as he observed the bustling street. The scene shifted to a serene outdoor setting, with the intricate roofline of a traditional building silhouetted against the sky. Moments later, Harold immersed himself in a soothing bath, feeling completely revitalized. He considered this a moment of supreme bliss. He reflected on his recent successes, noting how smoothly he had allied with Tuku and how quickly a sparring partner had been found for him. He couldn't stop smiling, pleased with how well things were progressing. As he relaxed, he noticed delicate sakura petals floating in the water, finding their presence quite tasteful. Later, as night fell, the exterior of a grand traditional building stood under the moonlit sky. Inside, Tuku, Erika, her father, and Yuno were gathered. Tuku addressed Yuno, asking if she had something to report to them. Yuno confirmed she did, explaining that she had investigated Harold-sama for a long period of time, acting upon Erika-sama's orders. Erika's father reacted with a questioning murmur. Erika then interjected, apologizing to her father for freely mobilizing spies, but insisted there was something she absolutely had to verify. Her father, intrigued, asked what that might be. Her father acknowledged that rumors were indeed circulating in the streets of the Stokes territory. Erika then pressed him, asking if he was aware of the specific rumors that Harold-sama had murdered a servant and her child. Her father, listening intently, questioned if she was suggesting the parent and child were still alive. She confirmed that the possibility of the rumors being false had indeed emerged. She continued, explaining that to verify the truth, she had enlisted the assistance of Yuno and her team, and the circulating rumors had turned out to be inaccurate. Her father then prompted Yuno to elaborate. Yuno, now addressing the gathered family, revealed that the parent and child were currently living in a small settlement known as Bloche Village, which was under the governance of another noble. She further explained that the mother had not changed her name, making it easy to locate them by consulting with the local villagers. Yuno recounted how she had personally gone to see the woman, but she had refused to speak about the incident at that time. The narrative then shifted to Yuno's direct actions as she arrived at a modest home, knocking on the door and politely calling out for a Mellerse. A moment later, the door creaked open slightly, and a woman peered out cautiously, asking who was there. Yuno, apologizing for the unexpected visit, introduced herself as a messenger from the Sumeragi family and stated that she had something to inquire about. She then added that the subject would become clear if she mentioned Herald-sama, causing the woman to look surprised. Yuno confirmed that her subordinate had been discourteous the other day, prompting the woman to wonder if that person could have been Herald himself. Yuno then explained that Erika, the daughter of the Sumeragi family, and Herald-sama were currently in preparations for marriage. The woman, a Meller, her expression now filled with concern, revealed that despite this, many within the Sumeragi family were voicing their opposition due to lingering suspicions of Herald-sama being involved in murder. She cried out, her voice filled with anguish, revealing that Herald was in a dire situation. Yuno, however, did not believe Herald would submit to such rumors, especially since Amela herself appeared alive and well. Amela, confused, questioned this assertion. She then explained that Herald was accepting the stigma of being a murderer and personally pleading guilty to the act, which led to him being disdained by the citizens. Despite maintaining a normal facade, he was secretly exhausted by the burden. Yuno continued, clarifying that she had no intention of exposing the hidden truth to the public. However, if Amela would be willing to share the truth, Yuno believed she could find secret supporters for Herald and asked her to consider assisting in saving him. Amela's eyes welled with tears. Meanwhile, a younger Herald stood with a serious expression, observed by his assistant and Tuku, a memory of a past burden. Overwhelmed by emotion, Amela collapsed to her knees, confessing that her silence was because of me. Yuno approached her, gently taking her hands, and acknowledged that Amela must be hesitant to share the truth, but assured her that she had come prepared for such a possibility. She declared her unwavering wish to do whatever she could to help Herald and Erika, even if it might cause Amela pain. Amela looked up, questioning, as Yuno embraced her, affirming her ability to help. Amela, now composed, invited Yuno inside, stating that the matter was too significant to discuss while standing outside. With a newfound resolve, Amela decided that if she was to be protected, she too would do everything in her power to help Herald. The truth of the past began to unfold. After Erika was sentenced to execution, Herald-sama lied, claiming he would use her as a test subject for his magic and locked her away in their dungeon. This elaborate deception was a means to cut her loose from Hayden-sama, the head of the family, after she had accidentally injured him. He then bought time to formulate a means for her to escape, eventually setting both her and her daughter free. It seemed that Herald-sama had also freely provided a wagon, a residence, household goods, and even relocation expenses to ensure their new life. Yuno believed Herald-sama chose to carry the stigma of Erika's actions to prevent her and her daughter's escape from being known, thus protecting their safety. The revelation hung heavy in the air as the others listened intently. As Erika began to walk away, the older man called out to her, demanding to know where she thought she was going. She confessed that she knew nothing of Herald's true intentions, nor did she try to find out, simply taking her feelings out on him. A wave of remorse washed over her, realizing she must apologize to Herald-sama. Even so, she acknowledged that he might never forgive her, but she felt compelled to try. However, the older man firmly declared that he could not allow her to go. She remained silent as her father explained that knowing the truth about Herald meant they should not divulge his secret, but carefully preserve it, for he was risking much to protect them. He warned that if Herald discovered details had been shared, he would become even more cautious and distrustful than he already was. Her father acknowledged that it was natural for her to feel the need to apologize. However, she questioned what she should do if she could not correct her mistake or bow her head and apologize directly. Her father then challenged her, asking if her desire to apologize was merely to comfort herself, rather than a genuine attempt to right her wrong. His hand gently rested on her head, a gesture of comfort and guidance. He told her that she could become Herald-sama's supporter. If she truly wished to make up for her past actions, instead of asking for forgiveness, she should strive to get closer to him. He mused that Herald, despite his brilliance, might be too brilliant, and that strength could sometimes alienate him. As his hand remained on her head, Erika reflected on his words, "Get close to him." Her father continued, urging her to watch over Herald's endeavors, to draw near to him, and to become someone who truly understands him. He further elaborated that while Herald's brilliance meant he required allies, he likely didn't need friends. He then questioned if becoming such an ally would be an easy task. Erika listened intently, a thoughtful expression on her face. Her father then added that he was certain even for Erika, Herald's fiancée, it would be a difficult path. He explained that even if she devoted herself to Herald, he might never truly open his heart to her. Looking directly at her, he asked if she possessed the resolve to believe in and follow such a man. Erika remained silent, her expression unreadable, deep in thought. Her father then conceded that she should still apologize for having raised her hand against Herald. He concluded by telling her that she didn't need to answer his question immediately, and could decide what she wanted to do after observing Herald up close. She stood silently, her back to the viewer, gazing out at the traditional Japanese architecture, lost in thought. Elsewhere, Yuno confirmed something with a simple yes, while Erika's father observed her. Erika's father then turned to her, remarking that Yuno seemed quite disappointed, much like when the engagement was first decided. He mused that this was simply how children grow. Erika, however, questioned his true meaning, reminding him that this was not their first experience with a child growing up. He chuckled softly, reflecting that knowing their beloved daughter, her feelings would only be stronger now. Yuno remained nearby, seemingly deep in her own thoughts. Meanwhile, a carriage arrived at a different location. Herald stepped out, his assistant announcing their arrival. As they walked, Harold and his assistant, accompanied by Erika, observed a sprawling complex. The assistant explained that this was the largest martial arts temple in the Sumeragi territory, a place where everyone, from children to adults, trained daily in various combative arts like archery, swordsmanship, and magic. Harold then turned to Erika, his expression serious, and demanded to know why she was there. His assistant interjected, explaining that he had brought her because her opponent had persistently requested her presence. Harold, though not fully understanding, decided to let the matter rest. Erika remained silent, her gaze distant. Inside a spacious dojo, Harold, now clad in traditional martial arts attire, stood ready. He inquired if someone had taught him how to properly wear the outfit. His assistant confirmed that Harold's opponent was already present, then introduced the young man named Itsuki. Itsuki, holding a bamboo sword, turned with a bright smile towards Harold. The assistant, standing nearby, offered an apology to Itsuki, mentioning something about the return. Itsuki, having just been introduced, immediately embraced Erika, exclaiming her name and commenting on how much more beautiful she had become since he last saw her. She struggled in his tight grip, pleading for him to let her go as she could not breathe. He continued to speak, asking if she had been eating properly and mentioning the souvenirs he had prepared, while also lamenting how lonely he was without her, unable to get a decent sleep for days. Meanwhile, Harold, witnessing this overly affectionate display, pointed towards Itsuki and questioned Tuku, asking if that could possibly be his opponent. Tuku calmly responded that he understood Harold's concern, but Itsuki's strength was absolute. Erika, still recovering from the hug, looked towards Harold with concern, asking if he was all right. Harold, his expression stern, declared that no matter how one looked at Itsuki, he was just a kid, and he had specifically requested to be set up with someone powerful. Tuku, with a slight smirk, retorted by asking if that observation didn't also apply to Harold himself. Itsuki, now composed, stepped forward and formally introduced himself to Harold, stating that he was Itsuki Sumeragi, Erika's older brother. Harold, his eyes wide with surprise, internally processed the revelation that Itsuki was Erika's older brother. He then formally introduced himself as Harold Stokes. Itsuki, with a sudden shift in demeanor, grabbed Harold's GI, pulling him closer. He questioned Harold, asking if he was forgetting something important, and then directly asked if he was Erika's fiancé. Harold was visibly stunned by Itsuki's direct question, a wave of shock washing over him. He then broke into a wide, almost manic smile, finding the situation wonderful. His smile widened further, his thoughts consumed by the idea of his little sister's fiancé. Harold watched as Itsuki continued his overly familiar display, gripping Erika's shoulders with an intensity that made her wince. She quietly pleaded for him to stop, clearly uncomfortable with her brother's boisterous affection.